Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't sleep well, even though it's been 3 weeks since that night. I live in a small rural home in western Pennsylvania with my wife Sarah and our 4-year-old son Ethan. We moved here 2 years ago to get away from city life, thinking the quiet countryside would be perfect for raising our son. Our property sits on about 5 acres, with woods bordering the back end of our yard. There's a small shed about 30 yards from the house, and beyond that is just dense forest for miles. On January 23rd, I had just put Ethan to bed around 1 in the morning. He'd been fighting sleep because of a mild ear infection. I was exhausted and just wanted to crash, but decided to make a quick check around the house before turning in. It's a habit I developed after we had a raccoon break into our garbage last summer. As I was walking down our hallway toward the kitchen, I heard what sounded like someone coughing or clearing their throat outside. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of a winter night, it was distinct enough to stop me in my tracks. At first, I thought it might be our neighbor Jeff, who sometimes walks his dog late at night. But then I remembered Jeff and his family were visiting relatives in Ohio. I went to the hallway window that overlooks our backyard. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in a pale blue light. I could see our yard, the shed, and the tree line beyond. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Then, something at the edge of the woods caught my eye. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. At the border where our property meets the forest stood what looked like a massive silhouette. I blinked hard, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. A dark figure, completely motionless. My heart started racing. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, and I've been hunting since I was a teenager, so I know what deer, bears, and other wildlife look like in the dark. This wasn't any animal I recognized. I quietly went to our bedroom and grabbed my night vision monocular from the closet. I bought it last year for nighttime hunting, and thank God I did. With shaking hands, I returned to the window and raised the device to my eye. What I saw makes my blood run cold even now as I write this. Through the green glow of the night vision, I could make out a creature standing approximately 40 yards from my window. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with what appeared to be grey skin or hair covering its body. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung lower than they should, nearly reaching its knees, and its torso was too broad, too solid. But what truly terrified me was its face. It looked disturbingly human-like, but off. The best way I can describe it is something straight out of a Viking movie. Prominent brow, deep-set eyes, a strong jawline. Those eyes were sunken into its face, and it was staring upward into the tree branches with such intense focus that I felt like I was watching a predator stalking its prey. I stood frozen at the window, afraid to move, afraid it would somehow sense my presence. My breath fogged the glass, and I carefully wiped it away with my sleeve. The creature didn't seem aware of me at all. It just stood there, staring up at the trees, occasionally tilting its head slightly as if listening. Suddenly, music started playing from the direction of the small parking lot about a quarter-mile down the road. It was faint, probably someone's car stereo. But in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The creature was positioned perfectly. It was hidden in the shadows at the tree line, concealed from anyone who might pass by on the road, but close enough to monitor any human activity in the area. It wasn't there by accident. It was waiting, watching. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing had deliberately chosen its spot, strategically placing itself where it could observe without being observed. As I watched, the creature shifted its weight ever so slightly. The movement was so minimal that without the night vision, I would have missed it completely. That's when another thought struck me. How many times had this thing been out there before? How many nights had it stood at the edge of our property, watching our house, while we went about our lives completely unaware? The creature made no sound that I could hear. No breathing, no rustling of leaves beneath its feet. It was eerily silent and almost perfectly still. Without technology to aid me, I would never have known it was there. I needed confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. I carefully backed away from the window and went to wake Sarah. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely touch her shoulder. "Sarah," I whispered, gently shaking her. "Sarah, wake up." She stirred, blinking at me in confusion. "What's wrong?" she mumbled. "There's something outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "In the yard, near the woods. I need you to see it." She must have read the fear on my face because she didn't question me or complain about being woken up. She just nodded and got out of bed. I handed her the night vision monocular and led her to the hallway window. "Look at the edge of the tree line," I instructed. Sarah raised the monocular to her eye and scanned the yard. After a few seconds, she lowered it and looked at me with confusion. "I don't see anything, Dan," she said. I grabbed the device from her and looked for myself. My heart sank. The creature was gone. The spot where it had been standing was empty. I scanned the entire tree line, the yard, even up into the branches of the nearby trees. Nothing. "It was just there," I insisted, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. "I swear to God, Sarah, it was right there." Sarah put her hand on my arm. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice careful, concerned. I tried to explain, but the words sounded insane even to my own ears. A giant humanoid creature with gray skin and a Viking-like face, standing motionless in our backyard in the middle of the night. I could see the worry in her eyes, not fear of what might be outside, but concern for my mental state. "Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs," she suggested gently. "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "I know what I saw." We stood there for several minutes, scanning the tree line together, but the creature never reappeared. Eventually, Sarah convinced me to come back to bed, suggesting that maybe I was overtired from dealing with Ethan's ear infection. I agreed, but I knew I wouldn't sleep. I lay awake until dawn, listening for any sound outside, any indication that the creature had returned. The house was silent, except for Sarah's soft breathing beside me and the occasional creak of the old wooden frame settling. When morning came, I went outside to investigate. I approached the spot where I'd seen the creature standing and searched for any evidence. Footprints, broken branches, disturbed earth, anything that would validate what I'd witnessed. The ground was mostly frozen, but there was a patch of softer soil near a large oak tree. What I found there made my blood run cold. The soil was disturbed in a way that couldn't be explained by deer or other wildlife. There were indentations that looked like footprints, but they were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and the shape was all wrong. They weren't clear enough to make out distinct toes or features, just large, unsettling depressions in the ground. I took photos with my phone, though they didn't capture the scale or strangeness very well. When I showed them to Sarah later, she said they could have been made by anything, a deer bedding down maybe, or several animals in the same spot. But I know what I saw, and I know those weren't animal tracks. In the weeks since, I've installed security cameras around our property and motion sensor lights. I've started keeping my hunting rifle closer at hand. Sarah thinks I'm overreacting, but she humors me because she can see how much that night affected me. I've spent hours researching online, looking for similar encounters in our area. There are a few vague stories from hunters about something big in the woods, but nothing that matches what I saw. I've considered reporting it to local authorities, but what would I say? That I saw a giant humanoid creature watching my house in the middle of the night. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what I saw, but what I sensed. This wasn't some mindless animal wandering through our yard. There was intelligence behind those eyes, purpose in its positioning. It knew exactly how to remain hidden from human detection while maintaining surveillance of the area. It was studying us, learning our patterns, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. Sometimes at night, I think I hear that same throat-clearing sound, but when I check, there's never anything there. At least nothing I can see with my naked eye. I've started sleeping in Ethan's room, telling Sarah it's to monitor his ear infection. The truth is, I'm terrified of that thing coming back and somehow getting into our house. I don't know what it wants or what it's capable of, but I'm not taking any chances with my family's safety. I don't know what to do next. Who would believe me? How do you protect yourself against something that most people would say doesn't exist? All I know is that what I saw that night was real, and it was watching us. And I can't help but wonder how many other homes it watches, how many other families are oblivious to the eyes in the darkness, studying them, learning their habits. Every night now, I stare out at those woods before closing the curtains, and I can't help but feel that something is staring back. Story 2. I've debated for years whether to share this experience. Part of me still questions what we saw that day in the mountains, but another part knows with absolute certainty that something was out there watching us. This happened in the summer of 2017, and it still keeps me up some nights. My buddies Dan, Lucas, and I had been planning an epic backpacking trip through the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado for months. We weren't casual hikers. We'd been doing serious backpacking trips together since college, but this was our most ambitious yet. The plan was to cover as much of the mountain divide as possible, heading north to south from Silverton toward Pagosa Springs over several weekend trips throughout the summer. It was during our third weekend expedition when everything went to hell. We'd been making good progress. The weather had been mostly cooperative, and morale was high. We were on our way back to where we'd parked at the Quartz Creek trailhead, feeling pretty accomplished after bagging a few more miles of the trail system. The day started perfectly. Clear blue skies, mild temperature, just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. I remember joking with Lucas about how we'd finally earned some good karma with the mountain gods after getting rained on during our previous trip. Man, I wish I'd kept my mouth shut. We were descending the west side of Columbine Pass, maybe around 3 in the afternoon, when I noticed the first clouds gathering. At first, it wasn't concerning. Afternoon thunderstorms are pretty much guaranteed in the Colorado mountains during summer, but these clouds built faster than anything I'd seen before. Within 20 minutes, the entire ridge above us had disappeared into a wall of dark gray. "We need to hustle," Dan said, adjusting his trekking poles. "That doesn't look good." Lucas checked his GPS. "Tree line's still about a mile down. If we push it, we might make it before." That hits. We picked up our pace, but the storm moved even faster. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees in minutes. The wind hit first, powerful gusts that nearly knocked me sideways on the exposed trail. Then came the rain, immediately followed by hail the size of marbles. It was like being pelted with rocks from every direction. "Over there!" Dan shouted over the wind, pointing to a rock overhang just off the trail. We scrambled toward it, sliding on the suddenly slick terrain. The overhang wasn't huge, but it was deep enough to provide some shelter from the worst of the storm. We huddled together, soaked and breathing hard, watching sheets of water cascade off the rock above us like a waterfall. "Holy shit," Lucas muttered, wringing water from his hat. That came out of nowhere. The three of us sat there, shivering despite our rain gear, watching the storm rage. I remember checking my watch. It was about 3:30, and the sky was so dark it looked like evening. The wind was the worst part. At that elevation, maybe 11,000 feet, it howled through the crags and rocks around us with an intensity that made conversation difficult. That's when I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, that natural wailing sound it makes when it funnels through rock formations. But after a few minutes, I realized there was something else there, something underneath the wind, a deeper tone, almost rhythmic, too consistent to be random gusts. I didn't say anything at first. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the way the storm was interacting with the landscape. But then I glanced at Dan and Lucas. Dan was sitting perfectly still, his head slightly cocked, like he was trying to hear something better. Lucas had this expression I'll never forget, a kind of alert wariness, his eyes scanning the ridge above us. They heard it too. None of us mentioned it. It's weird how that happens sometimes. You all experience something unsettling, but talking about it makes it more real somehow. So we sat in silence, pretending we were just waiting out the storm, but all of us listening to that sound beneath the wind. After about 45 minutes, the storm began to ease. The hail stopped, and the rain reduced to a steady drizzle. The clouds were still dark, but breaks of light appeared to the west. "We should keep moving," Dan said, checking his watch. "It's already past 4, and we've still got about 6 miles to the trailhead." "Yeah," Lucas agreed, adjusting his pack. "I don't want to be on this mountain after dark, especially not with more storms possible." I nodded, feeling an overwhelming urge to get down to lower elevation. Something about that sound had left me deeply unsettled, and I could tell the others felt the same way. We continued down the trail, moving carefully on the slick rocks. The landscape around us was eerie after the storm, misty, with low clouds clinging to the higher peaks and water dripping from every surface. The normal mountain sounds had returned, birds, the occasional marmot whistle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. About 20 minutes later, we entered a large clearing. It had been clear-cut years before, now filled with scrub brush and young pines maybe 10 feet tall. The trail cut right through the middle, exposed and open, after the sheltered switchbacks we'd been descending. As we entered the clearing, we heard loud thrashing from the far side. All 3 of us stopped dead in our tracks. "Probably an elk," Dan whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. Lucas silently reached into his side pocket and pulled out his .357 revolver. He always carried it for bear protection, something Dan and I had given him grief about in the past. I wasn't giving him grief now. We moved cautiously across the clearing, eyes fixed on the tree line where we'd heard the noise. I remember glancing up and seeing a hawk circling overhead, thinking how normal. That looked compared to how abnormal everything felt. And then we heard it again, that same sound from the storm, but now unmistakable in the still air. A long, drawn-out howl that existed somewhere between a wolf's call and something disturbingly human. It echoed across the clearing, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze. My skin erupted in goosebumps despite my rain jacket. Lucas raised his revolver slightly, turning in a slow circle. "What the fuck was that?" he whispered. Before anyone could answer, Dan suddenly shouted and pointed to our right. "There! Look!" About 60 yards away, crashing through the brush at the edge of the clearing, was a massive, dark figure. It was moving rapidly on 2 legs, with a powerful, loping stride that covered ground alarmingly fast. It was taller than any person I've ever seen, maybe 7 feet or more, and bulkier, with broad shoulders and a strange, hunched posture. I only saw it for maybe 3 seconds before it disappeared into the tree line, but those seconds are burned into my memory. The shape wasn't quite right for a human. The proportions were off, arms too long, torso too thick, and the way it moved. I've been in the mountains my whole life, seen every animal native to Colorado, and nothing moves like that. Then, from the opposite direction, the way we had just come from, came another howl, fainter but unmistakably the same sound. Lucas's face had gone completely white. "We need to go. Now." We didn't run. The trail was too treacherous for that. But we moved as fast as we safely could, practically jogging down the mountain. Nobody spoke. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush beside the trail made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed. I don't remember much about the rest of the descent. It's like my brain was so focused on getting the hell out of there that it didn't bother recording details. I do remember the overwhelming relief when we finally spotted Dan's truck at the trailhead, still about a half-mile away through the trees. We reached the parking area just as dusk was settling in. Lucas kept his gun out until we were all inside the truck with the doors locked. Dan's hands were shaking so badly he dropped the keys twice before managing to start the engine. The drive back to town was mostly silent, not because we were trying to hide what happened from each other, but because none of us knew how to process what we'd seen. What do you say after something like that? About halfway back, Lucas finally spoke. "That wasn't a bear." "No," Dan agreed. "Definitely not a bear." "Not an elk either," I added. "It was on two legs the whole time." "Could have been a person," Dan suggested, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe that. "A 7-foot person who can run through dense brush like it's nothing?" Lucas shook his head. "No way." We fell silent again for a while. "The sound," I finally said. "That howling. Did you guys hear it during the storm too?" They both nodded. "I thought I was imagining things," Dan admitted. "Me too," said Lucas, "until we heard it in the clearing. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what we experienced. Maybe it was a bear that briefly stood on its hind legs. Maybe it was an unusually tall hiker in dark rain gear. Maybe the storm, the fatigue and the fading light played tricks on our eyes, but deep down, I know none of those explanations fit. All three of us saw the same thing. All three of us heard those howls, and none of us have been able to explain it. We've returned to the San Juan Mountains many times since then for hikes and camping trips. We even went back to that same area the following summer. But we've never again experienced anything like what we encountered that day at 11,000 feet in that remote Colorado wilderness. Sometimes when the wind blows hard at night, I wake up thinking, I hear that sound. Again, that rhythmic, almost human howling that seemed to be calling to something else in the mountains. And I wonder what would have happened if we'd been caught on that trail after dark, or if we'd investigated the source of the thrashing instead of immediately heading down. I don't know what's out there in those mountains, but something is. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. And I can't help but think that we were incredibly lucky to have only glimpsed it from a distance. Story 3. I've been hunting for most of my life since I was 12 years old. My dad taught me how to track deer, how to read sign, how to be still and patient. I've hunted in all kinds of conditions, from snow to rain to blistering heat. I've had encounters with black bears, wild hogs, even a mountain lion once. Nothing has ever scared me enough to make me leave my spot. Nothing, that is, until what happened last year. It was September 17th, 2021. I remember the date perfectly because I'd been looking forward to that hunt for weeks. Early bow season had just opened, and I'd scouted a promising area in the swamp bottoms near the Sabine River, right along the Texas-Louisiana border. It's dense country, cypress trees, water oak, thick underbrush, but that's where the big bucks like to hide. I'd set up a ground blind the evening before, positioning it to overlook a narrow game trail that ran parallel to some flooded sloughs. Perfect funnel point for deer movement. I got there well before sunrise, around 5:30 in the morning. The air was thick with humidity, typical for East Texas in September, but otherwise perfect hunting weather. No wind to speak of. Temperature in the low 70s. Dawn broke slowly through the cypress canopy. I watched a barred owl glide silently between trees as the forest woke up. By 7 o'clock, I'd seen a few small does and a young spikebuck, but nothing worth drawing on. I was content to wait. That's what hunting is, mostly about anyway, sitting still, being patient, becoming part of the forest. I had food and water. My phone was off. I planned to stay all day if necessary. Around 9:30, everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The woods had gone completely still. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that sudden silence usually means something is moving through. I figured maybe a coyote or a bobcat was passing nearby, spooking the smaller creatures. But then I heard it. From behind my blind, maybe 100 yards back in the dense woods, came what I can only describe as garbled shouting. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not human speech exactly, but not animal either. It was loud and animated with this rough, almost growling edge to it. The sound was moving, slowly but steadily, from east to west, coming in my direction. At first I thought maybe it was other hunters, but that didn't make sense. The property I was on was private, and I had permission to be there. Plus, no hunter makes that kind of noise while moving through the woods. It would scare away every animal for miles. I grabbed my binoculars and carefully peeked through the rear panel of my blind. The underbrush was too thick to see anything clearly, but the vocalizations were getting louder, more aggressive. It sounded like, I don't know how to describe it exactly, like someone trying to talk with their mouth full of marbles, but with this deep, threatening undertone. It was jabbering nonsense, but there was something deliberate about it, like whatever was making the sound was intelligent. That's when the smell hit me. I've smelled some awful things while hunting, decomposing animals, wild hog wallows, swamp gas. But this was different. It was like rotting flesh mixed with wet dog and raw sewage, with this strange underlying sweetness like fruit that's gone bad. It was so intense it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. I had to fight not to gag. As the smell got stronger, this feeling of dread washed over me. Not just the normal nervousness you might feel hearing something strange in the woods, but something deeper, more primal. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. My mouth went dry and my hands started to shake. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. I still couldn't see it, but I knew it was dangerous. I've been in the presence of predators before, bears, wild hogs, and they give off a certain energy. This was like that, but amplified 100 times. I made the decision to leave. Quietly, I knocked an arrow onto my bowstring and eased out of my blind. I started backing away toward my truck, which was parked about a quarter-mile through the woods on an old logging road. I kept my eyes scanning behind me, my ears straining for any sound of movement. The vocalizations had stopped momentarily, and I hoped whatever it was had moved on. But then, when I was about 200 yards from my blind and maybe 25 yards from my truck, I heard it again. This time, it was to my right, moving parallel to me about 20 yards inside the tree line. It was following me. The sounds were different now, lower, more deliberate, almost like it was talking to itself. I still couldn't see anything, not even movement in the brush, but I knew it was there, watching me leave. I could feel its eyes on me. I drew my bow fully, keeping it aimed in the direction of the sounds. My arms were shaking from the strain and from fear, but I wasn't about to let go of my only weapon. I kept backing toward my truck, not blinking, not taking my eyes off the tree line. When my back finally bumped against my truck, I let down my draw without firing. There was still nothing visible to shoot at. I quickly stowed my bow in the back and jumped in the driver's seat. I didn't even bother with my seatbelt. I just started the engine and got the hell out of there as fast as I could on that rough dirt road. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me and the dense wall of the forest. I've gone over that morning countless times in my head since then. I've hunted my whole life, been in some pretty remote places, encountered all kinds of wildlife. I've never felt threatened enough to abandon a hunt like that. Whatever was in those woods that day moved like a predator and made me feel like prey. The thing that still bothers me the most was the deliberate nature of those sounds. They weren't random animal noises. They had cadence and variation, like language. and the way it paralleled my movement, keeping pace with me but staying just out of sight, that was calculated. I went back a week later in the middle of the day with 2 buddies, armed with rifles instead of bows. We found my blind where I'd left it. There were no unusual tracks that we could see, no physical evidence of anything strange. But none of us felt comfortable staying there long. There was this heaviness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. My friends noticed it too. I haven't been back to that spot since. I've hunted other areas along the Sabine, but I steer clear of that particular section of swamp bottom. Some people have suggested it might have been a person trying to scare me off the property, but that doesn't explain the smell or why they never showed themselves. Others have mentioned the legends of the wild man that supposedly roams the swamps along the Texas-Louisiana border. I've always dismissed those stories as campfire tales. All I know is that in 20+ years of hunting, I've never experienced anything like what happened that September morning. Something intelligent was in those woods with me, something that didn't want me there. And whatever it wasn't human. I'm just glad I listened to my instincts and got out when I did. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. I still hunt regularly, but I'm more cautious now about where I go, especially when I'm alone. And I always trust that feeling in my gut when something doesn't seem right. Because whatever was making those sounds in the swamp that day, I'm certain it wasn't anything I would have wanted to see face to face. Story 4. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Even after all these years, I can't shake what I saw outside my bathroom window that night in '85. I was 32 then, living alone in my little house at the edge of town in northern Arkansas. When I tell people where I'm from, I usually have to clarify. Not Fayetteville or Little Rock, but a tiny speck on the map where everybody knows everybody, surrounded by nothing but thick woods and swampland for miles. That night in October started like any other. The air was getting crisp, and I remember thinking I'd need to start using the electric blanket soon. I'd just finished washing dishes after a late dinner, meatloaf if that matters, and decided to take a hot bath before bed. My bathroom was at the back of the house, with this small square window high up on the wall. It was about 3 feet by 3 feet and sat a good 6 feet off the ground. I never bothered with curtains since it faced nothing but woods, and nobody could see in unless they were standing on something. I was running the water, testing the temperature with my hand, when I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just branches swaying in the wind, but there wasn't any wind that night. The air outside was dead still. When I looked up at that window, my heart stopped. There was a face looking in at me. Not a human face, not a face I can properly describe. Even now, what I saw filled almost the entire window frame. It had dark, matted hair covering most of its features, but I could make out eyes reflecting the bathroom light. They were set deep, watching me with an intelligence that froze me in place. The thing had no neck that I could see, just this massive head sitting directly on enormous shoulders. The shoulders alone spanned most of the window width. I remember thinking, this can't be a person. It was too big, too wrong. And it was standing at a window 6 feet off the ground, looking in at me like it was perfectly normal to be peering into someone's bathroom. I don't remember screaming. I must have. But what I remember is slamming the bathroom door shut with such force that a framed picture fell off the hallway wall. I ran to my bedroom, grabbed the phone, and called the sheriff with shaking hands. By the time Deputy Larson arrived 20 minutes later, whatever it was had gone. He shined his flashlight around the yard, but found nothing except some disturbed soil beneath the bathroom window. No footprints, he said, just like something heavy had been standing there. He thought maybe it was a bear, but bears don't stand upright for that long, and they sure don't peek in windows 6 feet off the ground with that kind of purpose. I had that window boarded up the very next day. Not just covered, I mean completely removed from existence. Got my neighbor's son to put drywall over it and plaster the whole thing. Painted it to match the rest of the bathroom. I didn't care about losing the light or ventilation. I never wanted to look at that window again. For years, I told myself it must have been some kind of weird trick of the light. Maybe a bear, like Larson suggested, though I knew better. Or some sicko in a costume, though that didn't explain how they'd been tall enough to look in. I convinced myself it was anything but what my gut told me it was. Something not supposed to exist in our world. I might have eventually forgotten about it entirely if things had stopped there, but they didn't. Fast forward to 2003. I was 49 by then, remarried with 2 stepchildren I loved like my own. My daughter Jessica was 15 and my son Tyler was 12. We'd moved to a slightly bigger house, but still in the same town, still near those same woods. My husband worked the late shift at the paper mill, so it was just me and the kids at home most evenings. One Saturday in May, the weather was perfect, and I took the kids for a walk through the field that bordered the eastern edge of the woods. Jessica had her little camera, taking pictures of wildflowers for a school project. Tyler was throwing a stick for our German shepherds, Max and Sadie. Those dogs were fierce protectors, barked at everything that moved and some things that didn't. We were maybe a quarter mile from the tree line when we heard it. It started as a low moan that built into something I can only describe as a scream, but not human, not animal either. Something in between that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It echoed across the field, coming from deep in the woods. Jessica dropped her camera. Tyler froze mid-throw. Even the dogs went still, their ears perked forward, but they didn't bark. They didn't make a sound. "What was that?" Jessica whispered. I didn't have an answer. The sound came again, followed by odd chattering noises and hoots that reminded me of the time we'd visited the Memphis Zoo. There had been a primate exhibit with chimpanzees that made similar sounds, but bigger, deeper, like they were coming from something much larger. "We need to go home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." We walked back quickly, not running but moving with purpose. The dogs stayed close, uncharacteristically quiet. No barking, no growling, just silent vigilance. That scared me more than anything. Those dogs barked at mail carriers, squirrels, and the wind. But whatever made, those sounds didn't trigger a single bark. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The dogs lay at my feet, still unusually quiet. I found myself staring at the dark line of trees in the distance, feeling like something was staring back. That's when I remembered the face at my window 18 years earlier. Over the next few years, strange things kept happening. Jessica started hearing things while walking home from her friend's house, what she described as chittering sounds, like monkeys but deeper, coming from the roadside ditches that ran alongside the woods. Tyler wouldn't walk to the bus stop alone anymore, but wouldn't say why. My husband thought I was being paranoid when I insisted on driving the kids everywhere, but he hadn't heard those sounds. The dogs' behavior changed too. They stopped wanting to go outside after dark. Max, who used to love chasing rabbits along the tree line, now refused to go near the woods. He'd sit at the edge of our yard, hackles raised, staring into the trees, but never making a sound. Then came the night in 2005 that Jessica still can't talk about without her voice shaking. She was 17, sitting on our back porch around 9:30 on a summer night. Her friend had just been picked up, and Jessica was just enjoying the cool evening air before coming inside. I was washing dishes, looking out through the kitchen window that faced the backyard and the woods beyond. I saw Jessica suddenly sit up straight, her body tense. Even from inside, I could tell something was wrong. I opened the back door just as she was coming in. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her face pale. Before I could answer, we both heard it, a loud, rhythmic whooping call that started high and ended low. It wasn't a coyote or an owl or any animal native to Arkansas that I knew of. It sounded deliberate, almost like communication. What Jessica did next still makes me shiver. She cupped her hands around her mouth and mimicked the sound, sending a similar call back toward the woods. The night went completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing, as if everything in nature was holding its breath. Then, faintly, we heard soft whistles coming from deeper in the trees, not bird whistles, patterned sounds, almost like signals. "Mom," Jessica whispered, "I think something answered me." I pulled her inside and locked the door. The dogs were pressed against the wall furthest from the windows, tails tucked, not making a sound. That night, we all slept in the living room with the lights on. My husband thought we were overreacting to just some weird animal sounds, but he hadn't heard them. He hadn't felt the weight of whatever was out there watching us. Jessica later told me that the first scream we'd heard that day in the field had reminded her of a furious roar. "Part bear, part man," were her exact words. She'd been having dreams about it ever since. Dreams where she's walking in the woods and feels something massive moving alongside her, just out of sight. I never told Jessica about what I'd seen at my bathroom window all those years ago. I didn't want to feed her fears, but sometimes, when she describes the feeling of being watched from the trees, I know we're talking about the same thing. Whatever it is, it's still out there. Last month, my son-in-law was hunting deer not far from our old property and came back early, visibly shaken. He claimed he'd found a crude shelter made of broken branches high up in a tree, too high for kids to have built, too well constructed to be random. When he approached it, he heard heavy movement in the underbrush nearby and decided it was time to leave. I still live in this town. The woods are still there. Sometimes at night, I think I hear those whooping calls in the distance. The authorities have never found anything, despite occasional reports over the years of strange sounds or glimpses of something large moving through the trees. But I know what I saw that night in '85. I know those eyes looking in at me weren't human. And I know the woods around this town hide something that science can't explain, something that watches us far more than we realize. Story 5. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day when I was 12. It's been almost 15 years now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I've never been able to fully explain it, and I don't think I ever will. It was a Saturday in late August, just a normal day on our family property out in rural Missouri. We lived on about 6 acres, with woods surrounding most of our land. My parents were inside making lunch, and my older brother David was in the garage working on his truck, like he always did on weekends. I was just hanging out in the backyard, messing around with this model rocket I'd gotten for my birthday. Around noon, I started hearing our dogs going absolutely nuts in their pen. We had 3 German shepherds that my dad kept in a large fenced area near the edge of our property. They barked at deer and stuff all the time, but this was different. It wasn't their normal, "Hey, there's something out there" bark. It was frantic, like they were terrified. At first I ignored it, figuring they'd spotted a raccoon or something. But after about 5 minutes of non-stop barking and whining, I decided to check it out. Looking back, I wish I'd just gone inside and told my dad. The dog pen was maybe 100 yards from our house, partially hidden behind our old tool shed. As I got closer, the dogs were going even crazier, all huddled in the corner of their pen furthest from the shed. That struck me as weird right away. Our dogs, especially Rex, the oldest one, weren't scared of anything. I mean, once Rex chased off a black bear that wandered onto our property, but now all 3 were cowering and whimpering. When I was about halfway to the pen, I noticed something moving on the other side of the shed. I could just barely see it from where I was standing. Something dark pulling at the wire fence of the dog pen. My first thought was, maybe it was a bear, though we rarely saw them in daylight. I should have run back to the house right then. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was that stupid curiosity kids have. I crept closer, moving toward the corner of the shed to get a better look. What happened next is the reason I still can't sleep sometimes. As I peeked around the corner of the shed, I came face to face with something. something that shouldn't exist. It was enormous, standing maybe 8 or 8.5 feet tall. I know because our dog pen fence was 9 feet high. My dad built it tall after a coyote got in once, and this thing was nearly touching the top with its head. It was pulling at the chain link, not like it was trying to break in, but more like it was curious about the dogs. When I appeared from around the corner, it stopped and slowly turned its entire body toward me. I'll never forget what it looked like. Its body was covered in thick black hair. Not fur exactly, more like human hair, but coarser. The hair covered everything except its face and part of its chest, which had this thick, leathery brown skin. Its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, reaching almost to its knees, with hands that looked almost human but much larger, with dirty, thick nails. But its face, God, its face is what haunts me. It had these huge round eyes that seemed to bore right through me. They weren't animal eyes. They had intelligence behind them. They were dark, almost black, but caught the sunlight in a way that made them shine. Its nose was flat and wide, and its mouth was slightly open, showing these massive block-shaped teeth that were stained yellow-brown. They weren't fangs like a predator. They were more like human teeth, but bigger, stronger-looking. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds. I was completely frozen. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, more like a deep grunt that I could feel in my chest. That's when I noticed the smell. It was like a barnyard smell, similar to goats but muskier and more intense. I don't remember consciously deciding to scream, but suddenly I was. It was like my body knew what to do, even though my brain had shut down. The moment I screamed, the creature flinched backward. Then I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life, back toward the house. As I ran, I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, but they weren't coming toward me. They were moving away, toward the forest that bordered our property. The ground literally shook with each step. There was more grunting, louder now, and the sound of branches breaking. I was screaming the whole time I ran. My brother David came bursting out the back door just as I reached the porch. He later told me my face was completely white, like all the blood had drained from it. Over my shoulder, he said he saw something large and dark disappearing into the tree line, but it was moving so fast he couldn't make out details. I collapsed on our back porch, hyperventilating. My parents rushed out, thinking I'd been hurt. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but I was crying so hard they couldn't understand me. David was staring at the woods with this look on his face I'll never forget, like he'd just seen something that changed everything he thought he knew. When I finally calmed down enough to talk, I told them everything. I remember my dad looking skeptical at first, but David kept saying, "I saw something too, Dad. Something big went into the woods." My mom wanted to call the police, but my dad wasn't sure what to tell them. "We can't call 911 and say there's a giant hairy monster on our property," he said. Instead, he grabbed his shotgun and he and David went to check out the dog pen. I stayed with my mom in the house, still shaking. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. They didn't look like they belonged to an animal. There was something almost human in them, but not quite. It's hard to explain. About 20 minutes later, my dad and David came back. The dogs had calmed down, but were still acting weird, staying huddled together. Dad said there were some strange marks on the fence where it looked like something had been pulling at it, and the ground around that area was disturbed, but there weren't any clear footprints, just some depressions in the dirt that didn't make sense to him. One detail I remembered later. When the creature turned toward me, I noticed it was definitely male. I was embarrassed to mention this to my parents at the time, but it's an important detail because it proves what I saw was real and not some guy in a costume. Also, there were these weird worn spots on each of its knees, about the size of a 50-cent piece, where the hair was missing and you could see the brown skin underneath. None of us went near the dog pen for the rest of the day. That night, there was a huge thunderstorm. The kind with lightning striking so close it makes your windows rattle. I didn't sleep at all. I kept thinking the lightning flashes would reveal that thing standing outside my window. The next morning, my dad and David went to check for tracks or evidence, but the storm had washed everything away. The ground was muddy, and any prints or signs would have been obliterated by the heavy rain. Just our luck. The one time we could have had proof, nature erased it. Over the next few weeks, we kept the dogs closer to the house, and my dad installed security lights covering the entire property. David started taking my dad's shotgun when he went to check on the dogs. I wouldn't go out alone for months. We never saw the creature again, but sometimes at night we'd hear strange calls from the woods. Not quite human, not quite animal. My dad said it was probably just an elk or something, but there was doubt in his eyes when he said it. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've spent years trying to convince myself it was just a bear or maybe even my imagination. But I know what I saw. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume, wasn't any animal I've ever seen in books or documentaries. Sometimes I try to research similar sightings in our area. There are stories. People seeing strange things in the woods, livestock acting weird, unexplained sounds at night. Most people around here don't talk about it much. When they do, they call it different names: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the wild man. But none of the descriptions quite match what I saw. The face was too expressive, the eyes too aware. I'm 37 now, with kids of my own. We don't live on that property anymore. My parents sold it when I was in college. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners have seen anything, but I've never had the courage to ask. To this day, I've never gone hiking or camping. I can't bring myself to be in the woods, especially alone. My wife thinks I'm just not outdoorsy, but how do you tell someone that you're afraid of running into something that most people believe doesn't exist? I don't know what it was. I don't know if it meant any harm or was just curious. But I know it was real, and I know it was intelligent. Sometimes I still dream about those eyes staring into mine, and I wake up in a cold sweat, that goaty smell somehow still in my nostrils. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And sometimes, when I visit my brother who still lives in the area, and we sit on his back porch that faces the woods, I catch him scanning the tree line too. He believes me. He always has, because he saw it too. Story 6. I still don't know how to explain what I saw that day at Caddo Lake. I've been hunting since I was 12. Spent more time in those Texas woods than most people spend in shopping malls, and I've never questioned what my eyes were telling me until that afternoon last November. It was supposed to be a normal hunting trip. I'd taken a Friday off work to get an early start on the weekend, hoping to bag a decent buck before the woods got crowded with weekend warriors. The weather was perfect. Cool but not cold. Overcast but not threatening rain. I'd been in my deer stand since before dawn, had a thermos of coffee and some beef jerky to keep me going. By around 2 in the afternoon, I hadn't seen much action. Just a couple of does early in the morning and nothing since. My legs were getting stiff and my back was starting to ache from sitting on that hard platform for hours. I decided to climb down and stretch my legs a bit, maybe walk around to get my blood flowing again. Nothing unusual about that. I walked away from my stand toward the lake shore, which was maybe a quarter-mile away through the cypress trees. I'd hunted this area for years and knew the terrain like the back of my hand. The woods were beautiful that time of year, cypress knees poking up through the fallen leaves, moss hanging from the branches. But something felt off as I approached the water. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I realized what was bothering me. The silence. Woods are never really silent. There's always something. Birds calling, squirrels rustling through the leaves, wind in the trees. But as I got closer to the shore, everything just stopped. No birds, no insects buzzing, nothing. Just dead silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. I slowed down, suddenly aware of every twig snapping under my boots. Part of me wanted to turn back right then, but curiosity pushed me forward. I'd nearly reached the shoreline when I saw it. About 50 yards down the shore, something was coming out of the water. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Tried to fit it into categories I understood. A bear, maybe? We get black bears in East Texas sometimes, or a large deer swimming across from one of the islands. But within seconds, I knew it wasn't either of those things. The way it moved was all wrong. It came out of the water smoothly, water streaming off its body, and then it stood upright at the edge of the lake, fully upright, on two legs. I froze where I stood, partially hidden behind a cypress trunk. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the thing would hear it. From where I was, I couldn't make out details clearly, but I could see it was big, much bigger than a man, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. Its proportions were wrong for a human, too broad, too massive. Its skin or fur, I couldn't tell which, was a dark color that blended with the shadows. The thing stood there for maybe 30 seconds, completely still except for its head, which turned slowly from side to side, like it was checking if the coast was clear. That deliberate movement was so intelligent, so purposeful, not like an animal acting on instinct, but like something that could think and plan. Then it started walking, not on all fours like a bear would do after standing up, but continuing on 2 legs, moving into the tree line with a smooth gait that made my stomach turn. Bears look awkward when they walk upright. This thing didn't. It moved like it was built to walk that way, disappearing into the woods on the other side of the small cove. I don't know how long I stood there frozen in place. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. My mouth was bone dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. When I finally let it out, it came as a shaky gasp that sounded way too loud in the silent woods. Something in my head was screaming at me to get back to my truck. Not run. Running triggers predatory instincts, but move quickly and quietly. I started backing away from the shoreline, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where the thing had disappeared. Into the trees. I didn't turn my back on that direction until I was a good 100 yards away. As I made my way back toward the trail that would lead to my truck, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was another hunter in some kind of ghillie suit? But that didn't make sense. No hunter would wade through Caddo Lake in November. The water's cold, and there are alligators. Plus, the size was all wrong. Too big for a human. I was so caught up in my thoughts that I almost missed it. A depression in a patch of soft soil just off the trail. I stopped and stared, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. It was a footprint, a single, enormous footprint. The ground there was soft from a recent rain, perfect for holding impressions. I knelt down to look at it closer, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone to take a picture. The print was huge, at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. It had 5 distinct toe impressions, broader and flatter than human toes, with what looked like claw marks extending from the tips. The impression was deep too. Whatever made it was heavy. I've tracked deer, hogs, bears, all kinds of wildlife. I know what their tracks look like. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. This wasn't anything that should exist in these woods. As I knelt there staring at that footprint, reality seemed to shift around me. All my life, I'd believed I understood the world I lived in. There were things that existed and things that didn't. Now I was looking at evidence that something impossible had walked this same trail, probably within the last hour. I took several pictures, then placed my own boot next to it for scale and took more. My size 12 boot looked like a child's shoe next to that print. When I stood up, I felt dizzy, like the ground wasn't quite solid under me anymore. I made it back to my truck in record time, walking as fast as I could without running. The entire time, I felt eyes on my back. That's not an unusual feeling. In the woods, sometimes you sense wildlife watching you, but this was different, more intense, more deliberate. I threw my gear in the back of my pickup and got behind the wheel, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I could get them in the ignition. Once the engine was running, I sat there for a minute, trying to calm down enough to drive. That's when I noticed the silence again. My truck was parked at a small clearing that serves as an unofficial access point. Usually, there are birds, squirrels, the distant sound of boats on the lake. But there was nothing. Just that same unnatural silence that had preceded my sighting. I put the truck in gear and started to turn around when movement caught my eye at the edge of the clearing. Just a shadow, really, moving between the trees about 50 yards away. Too big to be a deer, too upright to be a bear. My foot hit the gas before my brain could even process what I was seeing, and I fish-tailed out of there, spitting gravel and mud. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rear-view mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept seeing movement in the trees along the road, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. When I got home, I immediately downloaded the pictures from my phone to my computer. They came out clearer than I expected. The footprint was unmistakable. I spent hours that night searching online for similar tracks, comparing it to known footprints of bears, gorillas, though there obviously aren't any wild gorillas in Texas. And yes, even the supposed Bigfoot prints people have documented over the years. The closest match was to some of the better documented Sasquatch prints from the Pacific Northwest, but even those weren't quite the same. The print I photographed had those claw marks that aren't typical in purported Bigfoot tracks. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing at the lake edge, turning its head from side to side, moving with that smooth, deliberate gait into the woods. I kept hearing noises outside my house, probably just the usual nighttime sounds, but my mind turned every rustling leaf into footsteps, every gust of wind into breathing. It's been 3 months now, and I still haven't gone back to hunt in that area. I've told a few close friends what happened, shown them the pictures. Some think I'm pulling their leg. Others suggest I saw a bear with mange or some other explanation. One friend, after a few too many beers, admitted he'd heard stories about strange sightings around Caddo Lake going back decades. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if it was something undiscovered living in those swamps or something else, something that shouldn't exist in this world. What I do know is that those woods don't feel like home anymore. That place I knew so well now feels alien and threatening. Sometimes at night, I still wake up thinking I hear something outside my window, something breathing, something waiting. And in those moments between sleep and waking, I'm absolutely certain of one thing. Whatever I saw that day at Caddo Lake, it saw me too. And I can't shake the feeling that someday our paths are going to cross again. Story 7. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened to us that summer in '81. It's been over 40 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I've never shared this online before, but after watching some documentaries recently about similar encounters, I figured it's time to get this off my chest. Back then, my buddy Matt had inherited this wild piece of property from his uncle. About 40 acres of dense forest in Humboldt County, just north of the Hooper Reservation. It was seriously remote. The closest neighbors were miles away, and the property backed right up against BLM land that stretched for miles and miles of untouched wilderness, the kind of place where you realize how small you really are. That summer, a bunch of us were helping Matt build a small cabin on the property. Nothing fancy, just a basic structure where we could crash when we came up to hunt or fish. We'd work during the day, drink beers in the evening, and sleep under the stars. It was paradise for a bunch of 20-somethings with nothing but time on our hands. The property was rugged as hell. Steep slopes covered in redwoods, madrones and manzanita so thick you needed a machete to get through some parts. There was an old logging road that cut across the property, but it was mostly overgrown. The cabin site was on a relatively flat area near a spring, about half a mile from where we parked our trucks. It was early August when things got weird. We'd been up there most weekends that summer, and occasionally we'd hear strange sounds at night, these low, moaning growls that didn't sound quite like anything I'd heard before. But we figured it was probably just a mountain lion or maybe a bear. The wildlife was abundant up there, so we didn't think much of it. On this particular weekend, we were excited because there was supposed to be a meteor shower. The Perseids, I think. After dinner, we hiked up to this clearing about a quarter-mile from camp that had a perfect view of the sky. We brought some beers, laid out our sleeping bags, and watched the show. As it got later, most of the guys decided to head back to the cabin site where we had tents set up. I was feeling peaceful and wanted to stay a bit longer, so I told them I'd catch up. It must have been around midnight when everyone else had left, and I was just lying there alone, watching the occasional streak of light flash across the sky. That's when I felt it. It's hard to describe, but it was this overwhelming sensation of being watched. Not just casually observed, but intensely scrutinized. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before or since. It was almost telepathic, like something was projecting its awareness directly into my brain. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt this cold sweat break out all over my body. I sat up and looked around. The clearing was about 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by dense forest. The moonlight only illuminated a few feet into the trees, beyond which was absolute darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling was so powerful that I knew something was there, watching me from the tree line. I tried to play it cool, told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It got stronger, more directed, like whatever was watching me was moving around the perimeter of the clearing, studying me from different angles. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my sleeping bag and flashlight and started walking back to camp along the logging road. I wasn't running yet. I was still trying to convince myself I was overreacting. The road was about 8 feet wide, with steep embankments on both sides in some spots. My flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the darkness. I was maybe 20 yards from camp when I heard it, a rustling in the dense brush just a few feet to my right. Not the sound of something small, like a raccoon or possum. This was heavy, deliberate movement, the sound of something big pushing through thick vegetation. That's when I ran. I sprinted the rest of the way without looking back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I reached the cabin site where the guys had a fire going. They were drinking beer, and someone had a portable cassette player blasting Zeppelin. They laughed when they saw me, all out of breath and wide-eyed. "What's wrong, man? You see a ghost?" Mark joked. I was about to explain when Dave suddenly wrinkled his nose. "Jesus Christ, what is that smell?" And that's when I noticed it too, this powerful, foul odor that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was like a mixture of sulfur, like an oil refinery or something chemical, combined with this musky animal stench. And it was strong, like whatever was producing it was standing right in front of us, even though there was nothing there. "Holy shit," Matt said, covering his nose with his shirt. "Is that a dead animal?" The smell was so overwhelming that we all got up and started looking around. We traced the smell to a stand of trees about 30 feet from our camp. The weird thing was, when we approached from behind the trees, the smell disappeared. But when we went back to camp and were downwind again, it returned full force. We grabbed our flashlights and started investigating the tree line. That's when we heard it. Something large crashing through the brush, moving down the mountainside away from us. The sound of breaking branches and disturbed rocks tumbling downhill was unmistakable. Whatever it was big, and it was moving fast through terrain that would be challenging even in daylight. After it left, the smell dissipated. We all stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. "Was that a bear?" someone asked. "Bears don't smell like that," Matt said, "and they don't usually run from humans unless they're scared off." "Maybe it was a mountain lion?" Dave suggested. but none of us really believed that. We'd all spent enough time in the woods to know what bears and mountain lions sounded like when they moved. This was different, heavier, deliberate. We went back to the fire and cracked open more beers, everyone a bit on edge now. I told them about the feeling I'd had in the clearing, about being watched, and how something had followed me on the logging road. "Man, you must have spooked a bear or something," Mark said, but I could tell he didn't believe it either. We were still discussing it about 15 minutes later when the smell returned, stronger than before, like whatever produced it had circled back around and was now even closer to our camp. Matt went into his truck and came back with his rifle. Dave and Mark also grabbed their guns. I had a bad feeling about this. "Let's go find out what this thing is," Matt said, chambering around. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. "Whatever it is, let's just leave it alone." But they were already hyped up, a combination of beer and adrenaline making them bolder than they should have been. 5 of the guys decided to go after it, following the smell and sound of movement. I and 2 others stayed at camp, keeping the fire going. We could hear them crashing through the brush, calling out to each other as they pursued whatever it was up a narrow trail that led to the spring. They said they could hear it moving ahead of them, could smell it, but couldn't see it even with their flashlights. Then suddenly, everything went quiet. The shouting, the crashing through the brush, it all just stopped. For about 2 minutes, there was nothing but silence, and I felt my stomach twist into knots. Then we heard them coming back, running, not walking. They burst into the clearing, pale-faced and wide-eyed. "What happened?" I asked as they caught their breath. "It stopped," Dave said, his voice shaking. "We were following it up the trail, and then all the sounds just stopped. But the smell was still there, stronger than ever." "I think it stepped off the trail," Matt added. "It was probably standing right beside us as we walked past. We couldn't see it in the dark, but it could see us." We stayed up the rest of the night, keeping the fire roaring, taking turns keeping watch. Nobody slept. The smell never returned, and we didn't hear any more sounds from the forest. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was some kind of weird atmospheric phenomenon that made ordinary forest sounds seem more threatening. Maybe we'd all just freaked ourselves out. But deep down, none of us believed that. 2 days later, Mark and Dave, who were sleeping in a tent about 50 feet from the cabin site, woke up to find something disturbing. Right outside their tent entrance was an enormous pile of feces, not normal animal scat. This was massive, about 4 inches in diameter and probably 20 inches long. It wasn't from any animal any of us recognized, and we'd all grown up hunting and fishing in these woods. The placement was what really got to us. It wasn't random. It was directly in front of their tent entrance, like it had been deliberately placed there as some kind of message, a warning. We finished the cabin that summer, but things were different after that night. We were more cautious, stayed closer to camp, and always made sure there were at least 4 or 5 of us whenever we went up there. We never experienced anything quite like that again, though occasionally we'd catch that same distinctive smell on the wind, always distant, always fleeting. I've read about similar encounters over the years. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others have different names for it. I don't know what to call what we experienced that night. All I know is that something intelligent was watching us, something that wasn't human, but seemed to think like a human. Something that could move through dense forest in complete darkness with ease. Something that wanted to let us know we were in its territory. I'm 59 years old now. I've spent my life working construction, hunting, fishing, and camping all over the Pacific Northwest. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and all manner of wildlife. Nothing has ever made me feel the way I felt that night, that sense of being in the presence of something ancient and aware, something that existed on the edges of our world, but wasn't really part of it. Matt still owns that property. The cabin's still there, though it's been expanded and improved over the years. I haven't been back in almost a decade. Not because I'm afraid exactly, but because I respect that something else was there first, and maybe it doesn't want us there. Or maybe I am afraid. Maybe some primal part of my brain recognized something that night that my conscious mind still refuses to acknowledge. All I know for sure is that whatever watched me in that clearing wasn't anything I'd ever encountered before, and the memory of it still makes me check the tree line when I'm alone in the woods, even all these years later. Story 8. I still can't explain what happened that summer night back in '82, or maybe it was '83. Those years kind of blend together now. I was 15, spending my summer at Camp Warcroft near Nanaimo Bay on Vancouver Island. It was my second year there, and I was actually enjoying myself this time around, made some decent friends and all that. The camp had this tradition where they'd take us on an overnight canoe trip to this uninhabited place called Gerald Island. It wasn't far off the coast, maybe a 30-minute paddle, but it felt like a real adventure to us kids. There were about 20 of us boys going, plus 3 counselors, Rick, Dave, and I think the other guy was named Steve or something. The day started out completely normal. We packed our sleeping bags, some food, and paddled out to the island in the morning. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot. When we reached Gerald Island, we spent most of the day just being stupid teenagers, you know? Swimming in the bay, exploring the beaches, having rock-skipping contests. Some of the guys went hiking through the forest trails, but I mostly stuck to the beach with my buddy Mike. By late afternoon, we all gathered to set up camp on this wide, flat section of beach. There was driftwood everywhere, which was perfect for our campfire. The beach backed up to a pretty dense forest, tall pines and firs that went on for what seemed like forever. The sun was setting, and we all sat around the fire roasting hot dogs and marshmallows, telling the usual dumb ghost stories. When it came time to sleep, most of the guys set up right around the fire, but Mike and I decided we wanted a bit more space. We dragged our sleeping bags maybe 40 yards down the beach, still within sight of everyone else, but far enough away that we wouldn't be kept up by the loudmouths of the group. We found this perfect spot behind a big piece of driftwood that blocked the breeze coming off the water. I remember checking my watch as we were settling in. It was around 10:30 at night. The fire was still going strong, and I could see the outlines of the other guys getting into their sleeping bags. Mike and I were just talking about some girl he had a crush on back home when we heard shouting from the main group. "Hey, stop throwing rocks, you jerks!" someone called out. Mike and I looked at each other, confused. We weren't throwing anything. I sat up and yelled back, "It's not us!" One of the counselors, I think it was Rick, shined a flashlight in our direction. "Knock it off, guys," he called. "Someone could get hurt." "We're not doing anything," Mike shouted, clearly annoyed. That's when I saw it for the first time, just a glimpse, really. While I was looking toward the main group, something moved in the tree line behind them. Something dark and fast. It was only visible for maybe 2 seconds, but it was definitely upright and moving quickly between the trees. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Mike. He nodded, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but it was big. Too big to be one of the guys. And too fast," Mike added. We both stared at the tree line for a few minutes, but didn't see anything else. The forest was just a wall of black beyond the reach of the campfire light. But something about what we'd seen made my skin crawl. It didn't move like a person. It was too fluid, too fast. "Let's go back to the group," I said, already stuffing my sleeping bag into its sack. Mike didn't argue. We gathered our things quickly and jogged back to the main campfire. Some of the guys were still complaining about rocks being thrown. "Something's in the woods," I told Rick when we got back. "We saw something moving in the trees." Rick looked skeptical. "Probably just a raccoon or something." "No way," Mike insisted. "It was big, like person-sized big, and fast." Before Rick could respond, something hit the sand about 5 feet from where we were standing. A rock about the size of a golf ball. Then another one landed near the fire, causing a couple of guys to jump back. "What the hell?" Dave, another counselor, stood up and shined his flashlight toward the trees. "Who's out there?" he called. No answer, just the sound of the waves and the crackling fire. Then 3 more rocks came flying out of the darkness in quick succession. One of them hit a kid named Brian in the shoulder. He yelped in pain. "Everyone stay close to the fire," Rick ordered, suddenly looking a lot less relaxed. He and the other counselors huddled together, whispering urgently. More rocks started coming in, not a constant barrage, but every few minutes another volley would rain down on us. They were landing with force too, not just being tossed lightly. Whatever was throwing them had some serious strength. The younger kids started freaking out. One boy, Tommy, was crying silently, hugging his knees to his chest. The counselors tried to calm everyone down, but I could tell they were scared too. Steve, or whatever his name was, kept saying it was probably just some local kids playing a prank, but nobody believed that. We were on an uninhabited island, for God's sake. I dragged my sleeping bag behind a large piece of driftwood for protection and crouched there, heart pounding in my chest. Mike joined me and we both just sat there, flinching every time we heard another rock hit the sand. "What do you think it is?" Mike whispered. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But it's not a person, at least not a normal one." Around midnight, the attacks seemed to stop. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. Some of the guys started to relax a bit, thinking whatever it was had gone away. Dave even suggested we try to get some sleep. Then it started again, but worse. This time the rocks were bigger, some the size of baseballs, and they were being thrown with scary accuracy. One landed right in the center of our campfire, sending sparks flying everywhere. "Everyone stay down," Rick shouted. I peeked over the driftwood, and that's when I saw them. Multiple dark shapes moving just at the edge of the tree line. They were staying just beyond the reach of the firelight, but I could make out their silhouettes, tall, bulky figures moving with an unsettling grace between the trees. "There's more than one," I hissed to Mike. He raised his head just enough to look, then ducked back down. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. The rock throwing continued in bursts throughout the night. It would stop for 20 or 30 minutes, lulling us into a false sense of security, then start up again without warning. It was like they were toying with us, keeping us on edge. No one slept, no one could. We just huddled together, using driftwood and our backpacks as shields, waiting for dawn. One of the most disturbing things was how the counselors handled it, or didn't handle it. They were supposed to be the adults, the ones in charge, but they seemed just as terrified as we were. Not once did any of them try to investigate or confront whatever was out there. They just kept telling us to stay together and keep low. I remember thinking, if they're this scared, we must really be in danger. The attacks came in waves until about 4 in the morning. By then, the sky was just starting to lighten. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, everything stopped. No more rocks, no more shadowy figures, just the sound of waves, and birds beginning their morning songs, like nothing had happened. When it was fully light, Rick and Dave went to check the tree line. They came back looking pale. "What did you find?" I asked. Rick just shook his head. "Let's pack up. We're leaving." I went to look for myself before we left. The ground at the edge of the forest was disturbed with what looked like large, barefoot tracks pressed into the soft earth. But they weren't exactly human. They were too big, too wide, with a strange shape to them, and there were broken branches higher up on the trees than a person could reach. We didn't eat breakfast or anything, just packed our stuff as quickly as possible and got the hell off that island. The canoe ride back was completely silent. Everyone was exhausted, scared, and trying to process what had happened. Back at the main camp, the director asked Rick what happened, and I overheard Rick just say, "We had a rough night with some wildlife disturbances." That was it. No official explanation, no acknowledgement of the terror we'd experienced. It was like they wanted to pretend it never happened. I didn't talk about that night for years. Who would believe me? But about 7 years later, I ran into Brian, the kid who got hit in the shoulder, at college. We recognized each other immediately, and after a few beers, I brought up Gerald Island. The way his face changed, man, I'll never forget it. All the color drained out, and his hands started shaking a little. "I don't talk about that," was all he said, then changed the subject. That's when I knew for sure it wasn't just my imagination or some exaggerated memory. Whatever happened that night on Gerald Island was real, and it had left a mark on all of us. I've done some research over the years, read about similar incidents in the Pacific Northwest. The more I learn, the more convinced I am that we camped in a Sasquatch territory that night. I think they were trying to scare us away, drive us off their island. And it worked. I've never been camping since. Can't stand the thought of being out in the woods at night, vulnerable. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear rocks hitting the ground around me. That sound, the soft thud of stones landing in sand, it never really leaves you. To this day, I can't explain exactly what happened on Gerald Island, but I know what I saw, what I felt, and I know I'm never going back there. Some places aren't meant for us to visit, and some things aren't meant for us to understand. I just count myself lucky that all they did was throw rocks. Story 9. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family, and even they think I'm either lying or that I somehow mistook what I saw. But I know what I saw that day. It's been 24 years, and I still see it when I close my eyes. It was September 14th, 1999. I remember the date clearly because I had marked it on my calendar as the start of my camping trip. I'd been planning it for months, just me, my tent, and a week of fishing at Lightning Lake. I'd been working double shifts at the mill for almost 6 months straight, and I needed to get away from everything. That morning, I left my place in Hope around 7. The plan was to gather some firewood on the way to Manning Park. Firewood at the campgrounds is expensive as hell, and I knew a few good spots along the Hope-Princeton Highway where I could collect enough to last my whole trip. The weather was perfect that day. Crisp autumn air, clear skies. The kind of September morning that makes you glad to live in British Columbia. I'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when I spotted this abandoned gravel pit about 6 miles east of Hope. I'd been there a few times before. Nobody ever went there anymore, and there were always good fallen branches from the surrounding forest. I pulled my truck off the highway and parked near the entrance. I grabbed my work gloves and a small hatchet from the back seat, nothing fancy. I was wearing my usual jeans, flannel shirt, and work boots. Nothing special about that day at all. It should have been completely ordinary. The gravel pit itself was maybe 3 acres, just a flat area where they'd excavated years ago and then abandoned. Around the edges were these steep gullies where erosion had carved into the hillside. I walked about 150 yards along one of these gullies, looking for dead fall that would be dry enough to burn well. I remember stopping to take a drink from my water bottle and glancing down into the gully. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, at the bottom of the ravine, was this large, dark figure. My first thought was bear, which isn't uncommon in the area. I froze instinctively, but something felt wrong right away. The proportions were off. It was standing completely upright, not just for a moment like bears sometimes do, but fully upright and stable. It was digging at something on the ground, pulling at vegetation with its hands, paws. I don't even know what to call them. I stood there watching it for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. The fur was this reddish-brown color, not uniform like a bear's. It had longer fur along its back, almost like a ridge, and the undersides of its arms were a lighter color. But the thing that really struck me was how small its head looked compared to its body. The body was massive, barrel-chested and obviously powerful. but the head seemed almost too small, sitting on broad shoulders without much of a neck. I've hunted black bear and seen plenty of grizzlies over the years. This was no bear. The proportions were all wrong. Bears have this distinctive hump on their shoulders when on all fours, and their heads are much larger in proportion to their bodies. I decided to back away slowly. I didn't have a gun, just that small hatchet, and whatever this thing was, I wanted no part of it. I started taking slow, careful steps backward, trying not to make any noise. That's when I stepped on a branch. The crack sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. The creature's head snapped up instantly. It turned toward me with this fluid motion that no bear has, and it didn't drop to all fours like a startled bear would. It stayed upright, fully standing, and looked directly at me. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, thank God, but I could tell it was looking right at me. I felt it, like a physical weight of its attention. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was certain it was going to charge up the hill at me. I was trying to calculate if I could make it back to my truck before it reached me, and the answer was definitely no. But it didn't charge toward me. Instead, it turned and moved to the opposite slope of the gully, and the way it moved, Jesus. It climbed that steep incline with an agility that still haunts me. It didn't scramble or struggle. It pulled itself up using trees and bushes, grabbing them with its hands and using them for leverage. The strength it must have had to move that quickly up such a steep slope. I can't even describe it. It disappeared into a stand of lodgepole pine at the top of the ridge. The whole thing happened in complete silence. No grunts, no breaking branches, nothing. Just this massive creature moving through the forest like a ghost. I stood there frozen for maybe another minute, not sure if it was truly gone or if it was circling around to where I was. Then survival instinct kicked in and I ran. I didn't bother being quiet. I sprinted back to my truck, threw the hatchet in the back and peeled out of that gravel pit so fast I'm surprised I didn't blow a tire. I was shaking so badly I had to pull over about a mile down the highway. My hands couldn't grip the steering wheel. I sat there for maybe half an hour, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it was just a bear. But I knew better. The camping trip didn't happen. I drove straight back home and locked myself in my house for the rest of the day. I called in sick to work the next day too. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing climbing the slope, moving with that unnatural fluid motion. I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've read every book on North American wildlife I could find. I've studied bear behavior and anatomy. I've looked at every possible explanation. Nothing fits. Nothing explains what I saw that day. About a week after it happened, I got drunk enough to tell my brother. He laughed and said I'd seen a bear and my imagination had done the rest. My wife, ex-wife now, thought I was making it up for attention. The one time I tried to tell a co-worker, he started making jokes about Bigfoot and Sasquatch like it was all some big joke. So I stopped talking about it. But I never stopped thinking about it. I've gone back to that spot exactly once, 3 years later. I sat in my truck with a rifle across my lap, but I couldn't make myself get out. I just stared at that gravel pit for about an hour, then turned around and left. Never been back since. The thing is, I'm not some conspiracy theorist. I'm not looking for attention or trying to get on one of those reality TV shows. I'm just a logger who saw something in the woods that I can't explain. Something that shouldn't exist according to science. But I know it does because I saw it with my own eyes. I still work in the forests of BC. I still hunt. I still fish. But I never go alone anymore, and I never go anywhere without a firearm. And there are certain areas I just won't enter, no matter what. What bothers me most isn't just what I saw. It's that I know there are others out there who've seen the same thing, but are too afraid to talk about it. Too afraid of being labeled crazy or attention-seeking. Too afraid of the ridicule. I know exactly what I saw that morning in 1999. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else, something that lives in our forests that science refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes at night, I still jolt awake, swearing I can hear something moving around outside my house, something that walks upright but isn't human, something that remembers me just as clearly as I remember it. I don't know if it was what people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever. I don't care about the name. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and it saw me just as clearly as I saw it. That's it. That's my story. Believe it or don't, doesn't change what happened. But if you're ever on the Hope-Princeton Highway and you see a gravel pit about 6 miles east of Hope, keep driving. Some places are better left alone. Some things are better left unseen. And if you're in the woods and you hear a branch snap behind you, pray it's just a bear. Story 10. I've kept this bottled up for 24 years now, but I think I'm finally ready to talk about what happened that day and the other incidents that followed. I'm still not sure what I saw, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. All I know is that it was real, and it changed how I look at those woods forever. This all started back in the fall of 1999. I was 22 then, and my sister Caitlin was 19. We were visiting our mum for the weekend at her place in rural Missouri, about 30 minutes outside of Jefferson City. Mum lived in this little house surrounded by dense forest and farmland. The nearest neighbor was about a mile down the road. That Saturday morning, Mum suggested we go for a drive to look for wildlife. It was something we'd done since we were kids, just pile into the car and cruise the back roads, looking for deer, foxes, or whatever else might be out there. Mum had this old Honda Civic that had seen better days, but it was reliable enough for these little excursions. The day was perfect for it. One of those crisp autumn mornings where the air feels clean and sharp in your lungs. The trees were all these incredible shades of red and orange, and there was this thin layer of fog hanging just above the ground. We packed some sandwiches and thermoses of hot chocolate and headed out around 9 in the morning. We'd been driving for maybe an hour, just taking random turns down these narrow gravel roads. I was in the passenger seat, Caitlin was in the back, and Mom was driving. We'd already spotted a few deer and a red fox, which was pretty typical for the area, nothing out of the ordinary. We were on Lockwood County Road. It's this rarely used stretch that cuts through some of the densest forest in the county. The road is basically just 2 tire tracks with grass growing up the middle, and the trees form this kind of tunnel overhead. We came to this 4-way intersection in the middle of nowhere. No signs, no houses, just forest in all directions. Mum stopped the car to check her map. This was before everyone had GPS on their phones. I wasn't really paying attention, just gazing absently out my window while sipping my hot chocolate. That's when I noticed something brown moving in the trees, maybe 10 yards from the car. At first, I thought it was a bear. We occasionally get black bears in that part of Missouri, though they're pretty rare. But this was bigger and the wrong color, a sort of dirty reddish brown. It was crouched down, sort of hunched over, and I guessed it was about 3 or 4 feet tall in that position. I remember thinking it looked kind of like a giant monkey, which made no sense at all. Then it stood up. This thing unfolded itself from its crouched position and just kept going up. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was massive, not fat, but thick and powerful looking, covered in that same reddish-brown hair. The proportions were all wrong for a bear or any animal I knew. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees. But the worst part was that it was just standing there, watching us, not moving, not making any sound, just watching. I couldn't see its face clearly through the undergrowth, and honestly, I'm grateful for that. Something about its stillness made my skin crawl. It was like it was studying us, thinking. Without saying a word, I rolled up my window. I don't know why I didn't shout or point or do anything to alert Mom and Caitlin. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, so I just focused on this simple task. Roll up the window, like that would somehow protect me from whatever this thing was. Mom put the car in drive, and we continued on our way. Nobody said anything for a few minutes. I kept thinking someone would mention it, but the silence stretched on. I was starting to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing when Mom suddenly spoke up. "What do you think that was back there?" she asked, her voice weirdly casual, but with this undertone of tension I recognized immediately. "You saw it too?" I asked, feeling this flood of relief that I wasn't going crazy. "I saw something," she said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, "standing by the trees." "I saw it from the back seat," Caitlin chimed in, her voice small. "It was huge." We spent the rest of the drive trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was a person in some kind of hunting gear or ghillie suit, but none of us really believed these explanations. Whatever we saw, it wasn't something that belonged in those woods. At least not any woods I'd ever known. When we got back to Mom's house, we all silently agreed to stop talking about it. It was like we couldn't handle discussing it anymore. The experience got filed away in that part of your brain where you keep things that don't fit into your understanding of the world. I might have eventually convinced myself it was nothing, just a weird trick of light and shadow, if that had been the end of it. But it wasn't. 5 years later, I moved back to Missouri after college and got really into bow hunting. I loved the challenge of it and the solitude. There's something about sitting perfectly still in the woods for hours that connects you to the environment in a way nothing else does. I was hunting in an area about 15 miles from where we'd had our encounter, but still part of the same sprawling forest system. It was early November. Bow season was in full swing, and I'd set up my stand about 4 miles into the woods, far from any trails or roads. I'd been sitting there since before dawn, completely motionless, watching and listening. Around noon, I heard something moving through the forest maybe 100 yards away. Immediately, I knew it wasn't a deer or any normal forest animal. Whatever it was big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I could hear branches breaking and leaves crunching with each step. The sound was erratic, not the steady movement of a person hiking. My hunting buddy Mark was supposed to be about half a mile away in his own stand. I thought maybe he'd given up for the day and was heading back to the truck, though it seemed unlikely he'd be making so much noise. "Mark?" I called out, not too loud, but enough that he'd hear me if it was him. The forest went completely silent. Even the birds stopped chirping. Then I heard it, this deep, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a bear growl or a cougar or anything I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost human, but not quite. Like someone trying to mimic a growl, but with a voice much deeper than any person should have. It wasn't aggressive exactly. It felt more like a warning. "Stay away. This is my territory." I sat frozen in my tree stand for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Eventually, the normal forest sounds returned, and I climbed down and got the hell out of there as quietly as I could. I didn't tell anyone about that incident. Who would believe me? A weird growl in the woods could be anything, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, connecting it to what we'd seen years before. About a week later, I was back in the same general area, but I'd moved my stand about a mile away from the previous spot. I was determined not to let one strange experience ruin my hunting season. This time I'd brought my compound bow and a sidearm just in case. I told myself the gun was for protection against aggressive wild hogs, which are sometimes a problem in that area, but deep down I knew that wasn't what I was afraid of. I'd been in my stand since 5:30 in the morning, and around 10 I started getting that feeling you get when you're being watched. Every hunter knows that sensation. It's like a pressure on the back of your neck. Usually, it means a deer is nearby and has spotted you but isn't sure what you are yet. I slowly turned my head, scanning the forest, and that's when I saw movement about 50 yards away. Not the whole body, just glimpses through the trees. Hairy, reddish-brown arms and legs moving between trunks. Whatever it was big and moving on 2 legs. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I nocked an arrow, not because I planned to shoot, but because having a weapon ready made me feel less helpless. The thing, I can't bring myself to name it, moved through the forest parallel to my position, never coming closer but never moving away either. Then the trees started shaking. Not the big ones, but the saplings and smaller trees about 40 yards away. They were being shaken violently, their tops whipping back and forth. It wasn't the wind, there was barely a breeze that day. Something was deliberately shaking those trees. Next came the rocks, small at first, pebbles landing around the base of my tree stand. Then larger ones, some the size of golf balls. They weren't being thrown directly at me, but close enough to make the message clear: leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could, climbed down, and started walking, not running, just walking steadily, back toward my truck. The whole time I felt eyes on me, but I never looked back. I was afraid of what I might see. That was my last encounter, but I've never gone back to those specific parts of the forest. I still hunt, but I stick to public land closer to town now, areas with other hunters around. I've spent countless hours researching what I might have seen. Logically, I know there's no such thing as Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. But I also know what I saw, what my mother and sister saw, what growled at me in those woods. After 24 years, I still don't have an explanation. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe some kind of escaped exotic animal. But then I remember the way it stood and watched us, the intelligence behind that stillness, and I know it was something else entirely. I'm sharing this now because I'm tired of keeping it to myself. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, half the time I don't believe myself. But it happened. That thing is out there, or at least it was. And the worst part is not knowing what it was, or if I'll ever see it again. Story 11. I've never been one for paranormal stuff or ghost stories. Always been pretty level-headed, practical even. My wife Jessica says I'm the most rational person she knows, which is why what happened last month has been eating at me so badly. I just can't explain it. And trust me, I've tried. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip in Julian, California. Nothing fancy. My wife and I had been planning it for weeks with our friends Mike and Sarah. We needed a break from the city, from work, from everything. Just a weekend in the woods to reset. We'd done it before, set up the tent trailer, cook some burgers, drink a few beers around the campfire. Normal stuff. We found this spot a couple miles off the main road. It wasn't an official campground, more of a clearing that locals knew about. Perfect privacy, no other campers, just trees and silence. The spot was pretty secluded, dense tree coverage all around, creating this natural wall that made you feel isolated from the world. During the day, it was peaceful, but at night, those same trees cast these massive shadows that seemed to swallow everything. The first 2 days were exactly what we wanted. Hiking during the day, campfire stories at night. Mike brought his fancy telescope and we spent Saturday night looking at stars you can never see in the city. It was perfect, until it wasn't. Sunday morning is when everything changed. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I woke up early, around 5:40 in the morning. It was that weird pre-dawn time, when everything's still dark, but there's just enough light to make out shapes. Jessica needed to use the bathroom, which meant walking to the porta potty about 50 yards from our camp. I wasn't about to let her walk alone in the dark, so I grabbed my flashlight and we headed out. It was cold, that biting kind of morning cold that gets under your clothes. The forest was completely still, no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just our footsteps crunching on dirt and pine needles. We reached the porta potty and Jessica went in while I waited outside. That's when I heard it. A knock. A single clear knock that echoed through the trees from somewhere to the north of us. Not like a branch falling or animals rustling. This was deliberate. like someone taking a piece of wood and striking it against a tree trunk, with purpose. Knock. Just once, sharp and clear. My first thought was other campers, but I knew there wasn't anyone else for at least a mile in any direction. We'd driven the area before setting up. This sound came from deep in the woods. I remember standing there, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, scanning the tree line but seeing nothing. Jessica came out and asked if I'd heard it. I just nodded and we hurried back to the trailer. I didn't want to scare her, but something about that sound felt intentional. We were almost back to our camp when we heard something else. From the east this time, completely different direction from the knock, came this loud single whoop sound. Not an owl, not a coyote. It was too human, but not quite right. Like someone trying to imitate a human call. One loud whoop that echoed through the trees. The second that sound died out, the birds went crazy. We have a ton of blue jays in that area, and suddenly about 5 or 6 of them started chattering and calling from the trees around us. Then, just as suddenly as it started, they went completely silent again. The contrast was jarring. Frantic noise to absolute silence in seconds. By this point, my heart was racing. I got Jessica back to the trailer where Mike and Sarah were still sleeping. I didn't wake them, but I couldn't settle down. I sat by the window of the trailer, looking out into the woods, listening. About 20 minutes later, Mike got up to take our trash to the designated spot about 30 yards from camp. When he came back, his face was pale. He asked if I'd heard the weird knocking sound. Said he'd heard it clear as day while walking back, a single knock from the west side of the camp. That's when I realized whatever this was, it had moved. First north, now west. I told him about what Jessica and I had heard. We decided not to mention it to the women yet. No need to panic everyone if it was just some weird forest sounds. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal wildlife behavior. We made coffee, trying to act normal when it happened again. 2 more whoops within minutes of each other, from completely different directions. The first came from southeast of us, clear and loud. Then, before anyone could say anything, another from directly south, different locations, same exact sound. That's when Sarah pointed out something that sent ice through my veins. "They're surrounding us," she whispered. "North, east, west, southeast, south." She was right. Whatever was making these sounds was positioned at different compass points around our campsite. The sounds weren't random. They weren't overlapping or chaotic like animals would be. They were deliberate, almost like signals, like whatever was out there was communicating, coordinating. Mike suggested we pack up and leave, but something kept me from agreeing immediately. Curiosity? Stubbornness? I'm still not sure. Instead, I grabbed my hiking stick and walked to the edge of our clearing, just at the tree line. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" Silence. Complete silence. Not even birds or insects made a sound. I tried again, louder this time. "We can hear you out there. Who are you?" That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. Not a growl, not machinery, almost like a vibration more than a sound. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. Jessica grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "David, please, let's go." I was about to agree when Mike pointed to something on the ground near the edge of our clearing. Fresh tracks, but not animal tracks, not exactly human either. They were large, elongated impressions in the dirt that hadn't been there the night before. They led from the woods to within about 15 feet of our trailer, then back into the trees. By this point, we were all freaking out. We packed up in record time, not bothering with our usual cleanup routine. The sun was just starting to rise as we threw the last of our gear into the truck. As daylight filtered through the trees, the forest suddenly seemed normal again. Birds were singing, squirrels chattering, like someone had flipped a switch. We pulled out of there fast, not looking back. The drive home was mostly silent. What could we say? We'd all experienced it, but none of us could explain it. I've spent weeks researching since then. I've looked into wildlife in the Julian area, local legends, everything. The knocking and whooping sounds match some descriptions of what people call wood knocks and Sasquatch calls, but I've never believed in that stuff. Still don't, really. But I can't explain what we heard or the way those sounds formed a perfect perimeter around our camp. The calculated positioning is what haunts me most. These weren't random animal noises. They were coordinated signals from different points surrounding us. Whatever was out there, there were multiple of them, and they were communicating with each other. About us? Were we being watched, studied, warned? I've gone back and forth between rational explanations and wild theories. Could it have been other hikers playing a prank? But how could they coordinate so perfectly without us seeing their flashlights or hearing them move through the underbrush? Was it some kind of territorial display from an animal species I'm not familiar with? But what animal can make such human-like sounds from multiple locations? The tracks bother me too. I took pictures, showed them to a friend who works as a park ranger. He couldn't identify them, said they resembled human prints, but were too large, too deep in the soil, like whatever made them was exceptionally heavy. It's been 4 weeks, and I still wake up sometimes hearing that whoop sound in my head. Jessica refuses to go camping again. Mike and Sarah haven't talked much about it, but I know it affected them too. The forest returned to normal by sunrise that day, but I haven't. I keep thinking about those deliberate sounds, the perfect positioning, the feeling of being surrounded and watched by something that knew exactly what it was doing. I'm not claiming it was supernatural or paranormal. I'm not putting a label on it at all. All I know is that something intelligent was out there in those woods, something that communicated, coordinated, and surrounded our camp while we slept, something that left tracks unlike anything my ranger friend has seen. Whatever it was watching us, and sometimes I still get the feeling it followed us home. Story 12. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. Every time I start typing, I delete everything and close my laptop. But it's been over 4 years, and I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. I need to get this out, even if no one believes me. I know what we saw. It happened on October 3rd, 2019. My husband James and I were at our cabin on a small lake in coastal Oregon. We bought the place 5 years earlier as our getaway from Portland's chaos. It's completely off-grid. Solar panels, rainwater collection, propane for cooking, and a small generator for backup power. The cabin sits on 3 acres surrounded by dense forest, about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor and 8 miles from the closest town. We'd arrived that Thursday afternoon for a long weekend with our 2 Shih Tzus, Milo and Otis. The weather was perfect, that crisp fall feel with leaves just starting to turn. We'd spent the day hiking, had a simple dinner, and were relaxing in the living room around 8:30. James was reading some thriller novel while I was scrolling through photos on my iPad. The dogs were curled up on their bed near the wood stove. That's when we heard it. A loud, deliberate bang against the exterior wall, right by our kitchen window. Not like a branch falling or an animal. Bumping into the house. This was forceful, like someone had struck the wall with something solid. "What the hell was that?" James said, putting his book down. I remember feeling a sudden chill. Maybe a raccoon knocked over the recycling bin. We kept it outside near that wall. James grabbed his flashlight and went to check the kitchen window. Nothing visible outside. He opened the side door and stepped onto the small deck, scanning the area with his light. I stood in the doorway watching him. "Nothing," he said, coming back inside. "Bin's still upright. Maybe it was just a branch or something." We tried to relax again, but the comfortable feeling was gone. About 15 minutes later, bang, the exact same sound, in the exact same spot. This time, both dogs jumped up and started growling, which was unusual for them. They're typically yappers who bark at everything, but this was different. Deep, throaty growls. "Okay, that was definitely not a branch," I said. My heart was racing. James looked concerned. "Let's turn off all the lights so we can see better outside." We went around the cabin, switching everything off. The only light now came from the small LED above the generator shed, about 20 feet behind the cabin. It always stays on when the generator's running, casting a dim glow around that area. We moved to the bedroom at the back of the cabin, since it had the best view of the rear property. James was peering out the window when I heard him inhale sharply. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice tight. "Come look at this. Tell me what you see." I moved beside him and looked out. What I saw made my entire body go cold. Standing by our generator shed was something huge. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? But no, the proportions were all wrong. It was standing fully upright, illuminated by the shed's light. Reddish-brown hair covered its entire body. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive, towering over our shed. But what froze me in place was its face. It looked almost human, but wrong. It had this prominent brow ridge, a wide mouth, and a flat, broad nose. And its eyes, they were looking directly at the shed, studying it with what seemed like curiosity. I backed away from the window, unable to keep looking. My legs nearly gave out, and I sat heavily on the bed. "What the fuck is that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. James stayed at the window. "I don't know," he murmured, transfixed, "but it's huge, and it's definitely not a bear." I couldn't bring myself to look again. Meanwhile, our dogs were huddled in the corner of the bedroom, absolutely terrified. Milo, the older one, had even wet himself, something he'd never done inside before. James kept describing what he was seeing. "It's moving around the shed now, looking at it like it's trying to figure out what it is, the way it moves. It's not lumbering like a bear, it's deliberate, swinging its arms, almost human, but not." I've never seen my husband scared. He's always been the steady one, but I could hear fear in his voice. "Its eyes," he whispered. "There's intelligence there, it's thinking." This went on for what seemed like forever, but was probably only a couple of minutes. Then James said, "It's leaving. It's turning around and walking back into the trees." Only then did I return to the window. I caught just a glimpse of its massive back, disappearing into the forest. Even from behind, I could tell it was walking upright with a stride that seemed unnaturally smooth for something that size. We stood there in silence for several minutes, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, James turned to me. "We need to leave," he said flatly. I nodded, still unable to form coherent thoughts. We quickly packed overnight bags, grabbed the terrified dogs, and loaded everything into our Subaru. James brought his hunting rifle, which we normally keep locked in a cabinet. I didn't question it. The drive to the nearest motel in town was tense and silent. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following us. We checked into a dingy room that smelled like cigarettes, but I didn't care. I just wanted walls and locks between us and whatever that was. Neither of us slept that night. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone in a costume. But who would be in our remote area, in the dark, wearing something like that? And the size, James estimated it at 8.5 feet tall at least. No costume could explain that. We returned to the cabin the next morning, feeling slightly braver in daylight. James immediately went to the generator shed with a measuring tape. He marked where the creature's head had been in relation to the shed window, then measured the height. His estimate had been right. Whatever it was, stood at least 8.5 feet tall. We searched for footprints, but found nothing definitive. The ground around our cabin is mostly packed sand and moss, which doesn't hold prints well. But we did find a path of crushed ferns and disturbed mushrooms leading into the woods, marking the creature's route. Later, examining the exterior wall by the kitchen window, we realized what had likely happened. Our recycling bin sat just below that window, and it contained empty cans and bottles. The creature had probably been investigating it, maybe even trying to look through our kitchen window. The realization that it had been that close, possibly peering into our home while we sat oblivious inside, sent a chill through me that I still feel today. We ended up cutting our trip short and returning to Portland that afternoon. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that face, that not quite human face with eyes that seemed to understand what they were looking at. We've been back to the cabin many times since then. We installed motion-activated lights and cameras around the property. We've never seen it again. But sometimes, when we're there at night, I feel watched. The dogs still get anxious after dark, huddling close to us instead of exploring like they used to. I've researched extensively since that night. I know what people say about Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings, that they're just bears or hoaxes or confused identifications. Before this, I would have agreed. I would have laughed at anyone telling me this story. But I know what we saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. The height, the movements, the intelligence in its eyes, none of that can be explained away. James thinks it was curious about us, about our lights, our generator, our presence in its territory. He believes it wasn't aggressive, just investigating. Maybe he's right, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying to know that something like that exists, moving silently through the forests, watching. I've hesitated to share this because I know how it sounds. I've always considered myself rational, skeptical even. I work in accounting, for God's sake. I deal in concrete numbers and provable facts. James is an electrical engineer, equally grounded in reality. We're not people who see things that aren't there, but that night changed everything I thought I knew about our world. There are things out there that we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what's possible and what isn't. I don't know what to call what we saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, an unknown primate species. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it was studying us just as much as we were studying it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching our cabin when we're not around. If it remembers us the way we remember it. If it tells its own kind about the strange, small creatures with their bright lights and humming machines. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to share this, because even now, 4 years later, whenever I hear an unexpected sound against our cabin wall, my whole body freezes, and I wonder if it's come back to investigate us again. Story 13. I still can't believe what happened that day. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to make sense of it, but I can't. I'm not normally one to share personal stories online, but I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. It was supposed to be a normal Friday afternoon. My husband Michael and I decided to take our daughters, Emma 9 and Lily 6, to our family property about 40 miles outside of town. The girls had been cooped up all week with school, and Michael wanted to get some target practice in. We've owned this land for about 4 years. It's nothing fancy, just some acreage with woods, a small pond, and open pastures that we planted specifically for elk hunting. We arrived around 3 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with just enough clouds to keep the sun from beating down on us. We drove down this dirt access road until we reached an open pasture on the left. Michael parked the SUV right in the middle of it, which I thought was odd at the time. "Why are we parking here?" I asked. "Just in case it rains," he said. "Don't want to get stuck in mud near the tree line." The girls were already bouncing in their seats, eager to explore. After gathering our backpacks with snacks, water bottles, and Michael's gun case, we started walking back to the dirt road and then headed east toward the pond. It's not far, maybe a 10-minute walk. Emma and Lily ran ahead, their voices carrying through the quiet countryside. I remember feeling so at peace watching them explore, climbing over the pond embankments, trying to skip rocks across the water, and squatting down to look for tadpoles along the edge. We'd been at the pond for maybe 30 minutes when we heard it, a deep, guttural grunting sound coming from the gulch behind us. It wasn't like any animal noise I'd heard before. Not a bear, not an elk. It was different. Michael and I locked eyes immediately. He didn't say anything, but his expression changed from relaxed to alert in an instant. "Girls," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Time to head back." "But Mom, I almost caught one," Lily protested, her hands cupped in the shallow water. "We'll come back another time," Michael said firmly. "Let's go now." The girls must have sensed our urgency because they didn't argue further. We gathered our things quickly and started walking back toward the car. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for movement, but saw nothing unusual. After walking for about 5 minutes without hearing anything else, Michael seemed to relax a bit. "I still want to get some practice in," he said. The sound was probably just an elk or something. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to seem paranoid in front of the girls. We continued along the dirt road until we were across from where we'd parked. On the opposite side of the road from our pasture was a deep ravine, the kind with walls taller than our heads that ran parallel to the road. "This spot looks good," Michael said, setting down his gun case. "Girls, stay with your mom." The girls stood beside me as Michael prepared his targets, just paper pinned to a portable stand he'd brought. He set it up about 15 yards away against the far wall of the ravine. He took out his pistol, checked it was loaded, and started his practice. The sound of the shots echoed in the ravine. Emma covered her ears, but Lily watched with fascination. I was focused on the girls, making sure they stayed back, when I felt something change in the air. It's hard to explain, like a shift in pressure or energy. Michael had just finished a round of shots when something massive suddenly appeared in the ravine in front of us. It happened so fast. One moment there was nothing there, and the next this creature was standing no more than 10 meters away. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was enormous, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. But what struck me wasn't just its size, it was its appearance. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot, seen the classic pictures and drawings, but this wasn't that. This thing had grayish hair, not the dark brown or black you see in all the documentaries. Its hair was long, maybe 5 or 6 inches, but it wasn't thick and matted like you'd expect. In places, it was thin enough that I could see grayish skin underneath. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its upper arms looked powerful, built for strength rather than speed. But its torso seemed almost disproportionately short compared to its limbs. And its head, it was rounder than I expected, more human-like than the flat, block-like head you see in Bigfoot illustrations. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a couple of seconds, it just stood there looking directly at us. Its eyes, I still see them in my nightmares. Dark, intelligent, assessing. Not animal eyes. Something else. Then, in one fluid motion, it bounded out of the ravine. Just one step and it was gone over the edge. I've never seen anything move like that. The power in its legs must have been incredible. We were frozen in shock. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then Lily started to cry, which snapped us back to reality. "Move, now!" Michael's voice was tight with fear. He grabbed Lily, lifting her up in one swift motion. I grabbed Emma's hand, and we ran. We sprinted back along the dirt road toward our car, which suddenly seemed miles away rather than just a few hundred yards. Emma stumbled once, and I practically dragged her up, keeping her moving. That's when we heard it. Crashing sounds coming from the brush to our right, parallel to the road. Something large was moving through the trees and undergrowth, keeping pace with us. It was heading toward our car too. "It's cutting us off," Michael gasped, still carrying Lily, who was sobbing uncontrollably now. The brush line ended about 20 yards from where we'd parked in the middle of the pasture. We needed to cross that open space to reach the car. We reached the edge of the brush line first and made a mad dash across the open pasture. Michael yanked the car door open, practically throwing Lily into the back seat. I pushed Emma in after her and jumped into the passenger seat as Michael scrambled behind the wheel. The doors locked with a click that seemed obscenely normal given the circumstances. Michael's hands were shaking so badly, he fumbled with the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. From the sound of it, the creature had stopped at the edge of the brush line, just out of sight. I could hear branches moving, the rustle of leaves. Was it watching us? Waiting for something? Go, 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 I urged, and Michael slammed the car into reverse, then drive, tires spinning in the dirt as we tore out of there. The girls were hysterical in the back seat. Emma kept asking what it was while Lily just cried. I turned around, trying to comfort them while keeping my eyes on the tree line, half expecting to see that thing burst out after us. We drove in tense silence for several miles before Michael finally spoke. Did you see that thing?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes," I said, still trying to process it myself. It wasn't what I expected." "What wasn't it, Mommy?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. I didn't know what to tell her. How do you explain something like that to a child when you don't understand it yourself? "Just a big animal, sweetie," Michael answered for me. "But we're safe now." But were we? That thing had looked at us with such awareness, like it knew exactly what we were capable of. Even with Michael's gun, I felt utterly defenseless against it. When we got home, we tried to act normal for the girls' sake. We ordered pizza, watched a movie, tucked them into bed with extra hugs and reassurances that there were no monsters. But later that night, when it was just Michael and me, we talked about what we'd seen. I described the creature in detail, the grey coloration, the visible skin, the proportions that seemed off compared to what we think of as Bigfoot. "It's not right," I kept saying. "It doesn't match the descriptions." Michael suggested we report it, but to whom? The local rangers who would think we were crazy? Some cryptozoology website that would sensationalize our experience? We decided to keep it to ourselves, at least for now. But I can't stop thinking about it, about those eyes, about how it moved with such purpose and intelligence. It's been 3 weeks since that day. We haven't gone back to the property. The girls have stopped asking about it, distracted by school and friends. But Michael and I can't forget. Sometimes I catch him staring out the window at night, scanning the tree line of our backyard. Sometimes I do the same. What troubles me most isn't just what we saw, but what it means. If something like that exists, something that doesn't match any known animal, that moves with intelligence and purpose, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I don't have answers. I just know what I saw that day in the ravine. And I know that sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the darkness, eyes that assessed us once and might be doing so again. I just needed to tell someone. Thanks for reading this far. I don't expect you to believe me, but it helps just to write it down. Maybe someone else has seen it too, this grey creature that doesn't fit the mold. If you have, please let me know. I need to know we're not alone in this. Story 14. I've kept this bottled up for years, only telling close friends and family, but I need to get this off my chest once and for all. I know exactly what I saw that day, no matter how many people have laughed it off or tried to explain it away. It was the summer of 2009, early July. I remember because it was just after the 4th, and I was still finding scraps of burnt fireworks in my yard from the weekend celebrations. I was 30 at the time, driving my old Ford Explorer up I-75 through northern Michigan. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies, about 75 degrees, windows down kind of day. I was heading up to my parents' place on Mullet Lake for a long weekend visit. Anyone who's driven that stretch of I-75 north of Wolverine knows it's usually pretty empty. Just miles of dense forest on both sides of the highway, occasional exits to tiny towns, and not much traffic, especially on weekdays. I was cruising along around 70 miles per hour, thinking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the drive and looking forward to getting out on the lake. That's when I noticed brake lights ahead of me. At first I thought maybe there was construction or an accident, but as I got closer, I realized cars were completely stopped in both northbound lanes. This was weird. I'd driven this route dozens of times and rarely even hit slowdowns, let alone a complete standstill. I started tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, getting a bit annoyed because I was only about 20 minutes from my destination. As I inched forward, I could see drivers ahead of me were looking off to the right side of the road. Some people had even gotten out of their cars and were pointing into the woods. I figured maybe a deer had been hit or there was a spectacular car wreck. When I finally got close enough, I looked over to see what the commotion was about. That's when I saw it. At the tree line on the right side of the highway, something massive was emerging from the forest. My first thought was, that's a huge bear, which wouldn't be that unusual for northern Michigan. Black bears are pretty common up there. But then I realized this thing was walking upright on two legs, and it was tall, way taller than any bear I'd ever seen or heard about. I'm talking at least 7, maybe 8 feet high. I remember feeling suddenly cold despite the warm day. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles turned white. I wasn't scared exactly, more like my brain was struggling to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. This thing had longer legs relative to its body, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. It was covered head to toe in dark, matted hair, not quite black, more of a deep brown with some reddish tints where the sunlight hit it. Its movements were deliberate but smooth, not lumbering like you'd expect from something that size. The weirdest detail I remember is its hands. They looked almost curled under, like it normally walked on all fours, but had stood up to cross the road, and its head sat directly on broad shoulders. There wasn't much of a neck to speak of. By this point, I had come to a complete stop, maybe 50 yards from where this thing was crossing. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even unlock the screen. And honestly, part of me didn't want to look away, afraid I'd miss something or that it would suddenly disappear. The creature paused in the middle of the highway. It turned its head slowly, scanning the line of stopped cars. I swear it looked right at me for a split second. Its face was mostly obscured by hair, but I could make out deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. I couldn't see a mouth, just darkness under what looked like a short, flat nose. Then, as deliberately as it had emerged, it continued across the road, crossed the southbound lanes, which had also stopped, and disappeared into the thick forest on the other side. The whole crossing probably took less than a minute, but it felt like time had stretched out forever. For several seconds after it vanished, nobody moved. Then I heard car doors slamming and saw people getting out, pointing and talking excitedly. A few brave souls even started walking toward where the creature had disappeared, though nobody actually ventured into the woods. I finally managed to unlock my phone, but it was too late for a picture. I rolled down my window and called out to the guy in the car next to me, "Did you see that?" He just nodded, wide-eyed, and said, "What the hell was that thing?" Traffic started moving again after a few minutes. As I drove past the spot where it had crossed, I slowed down and stared into the woods, half expecting to see it watching us from between the trees. But there was nothing, just the dense Michigan forest, unchanged and unrevealing. When I finally reached my parents' cottage about 20 minutes later, I burst through the door, still amped up on adrenaline. My dad was in the kitchen making sandwiches, and my mom and sister were out on the deck. "You guys aren't going to believe what I just saw on I-75, I blurted out. I told them everything, the size of the creature, the way it moved, how traffic had stopped in both directions. I expected shock, questions, maybe even concern. Instead, my sister started laughing. "Nate's seen Bigfoot," she announced to everyone, making air quotes with her fingers. My dad chuckled and slapped me on the shoulder. "Probably just a bear, son. They can look mighty strange when they stand up." "No, Dad, it wasn't a bear," I insisted. I know what bears look like. This was something else. It was walking upright the whole time, not just rearing up, and it was huge, way bigger than any black bear. My mom, always the peacemaker, said, "Well, there have been stories about strange things in these woods for years. The Native Americans had legends about forest giants, but I could tell she was just humoring me. By dinner, it had become the weekend's running joke. Every time someone went to the kitchen, they'd announce they were going to look for Bigfoot. My brother-in-law, who arrived later that night, suggested I'd been sampling the vacation beers a little early. I eventually stopped bringing it up. The weekend went on, boating, fishing, grilling out, but I couldn't shake what I'd seen. Each night I'd lie awake, replaying those moments in my head, trying to convince myself it really was just a bear, or maybe someone in a costume. Though who would wear a full-body costume in July heat, miles from anywhere? When I got home after the weekend, I started researching. I looked up bears in Michigan, thinking maybe there was some explanation. An unusually large specimen, or a grizzly, that had somehow wandered far from its normal range. But nothing matched what I'd seen. Then I started looking into Bigfoot sightings in Michigan. I'd never given much thought to the whole Bigfoot thing before. It always seemed like campfire stories or hoaxes, but there were hundreds of reports from Michigan alone, many from the very region I'd been driving through. Some descriptions matched exactly what I'd seen: the height, the reddish-brown hair, the way it moved. I found online forums where people shared their encounters. Some sounded crazy, sure, but others were from normal people, hunters, hikers, campers, who had no reason to make up stories. People who, like me, had been perfectly rational before their experience and found themselves questioning everything afterward. A few weeks later, I worked up the courage to call the local sheriff's department for the county where I'd had my sighting. I asked if anyone had reported anything unusual on I-75 that day. The deputy who answered sounded bored and said they hadn't received any official reports, but then added, though dispatch did get a couple calls about a traffic jam caused by a large animal crossing. He chuckled as he said it. I've spent years trying to convince myself it was something explainable, a bear with mange that made it look different, an escaped zoo animal, an elaborate prank. But deep down, I know better. The thing that bothers me most isn't the creature itself. It's how quickly everyone dismissed what I saw. How easily they laughed it off. Because here's the thing, I wasn't the only witness. Dozens of other drivers saw the same thing I did. Cars stopped in both directions. People got out and pointed. The guy in the car next to me confirmed it. Yet somehow no official report exists. No newspaper article. No viral video. This was 2009, so smartphones weren't as ubiquitous, but still. It's like the event happened in a bubble that popped as soon as it was over. I'm 37 now, and I still drive up to Mullet Lake several times a year. Every time I pass that stretch of I-75, I slow down and scan the tree line. I've never seen anything like it again, but I always feel a prickle on the back of my neck, a sense that I'm being watched from the dense shadows between the trees. I don't know what I saw that summer day. I can't explain it, can't categorize it, but I know it was real. It moved through our world for just a moment, visible to those of us who happened to be in the right place at the right time, then slipped back into whatever hidden realm it calls home. So laugh if you want. Tell me it was a bear or my imagination. I know what I saw crossing I-75 that day, and sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder, does it remember seeing me too? Story 15. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened to me that day. Not even my wife knows all the details. For over 40 years, I've tried to rationalize it, explain it away, or just plain forget it. But I can't. What I saw in those woods in May of '78 still haunts me. I'm sharing this now because I recently saw a news report about strange sounds in that same area of Hopkins County, and it brought everything rushing back. I was 23 then, young and confident. I'd been hunting those woods since I was a boy, following in my dad's footsteps. That particular day was unusually warm for May. Must have been in the high 70s, with that sticky humidity that makes your clothes cling to your skin. I remember because I kept wiping sweat from my eyes as I hiked through the forest. I'd parked my old Ford pickup at the logging road entrance around 6 in the morning. The plan was simple: scout some new territory for the coming deer season, maybe do a little fishing at the creek. I had my Remington with me, not because I planned on shooting anything, but because that's just what you did in those parts. You never went into the woods unarmed. The forest that morning felt different somehow, quieter. I remember thinking it was odd that I wasn't hearing many birds. Usually those woods were alive with sound, especially in spring, but that day there was this strange stillness that I initially attributed to the heat. I'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when I came across a creek I'd visited a few times before. There was a deep pool on the far side that sometimes held some decent-sized bass, so I decided to check it out. The water was clear and cool, and I spent about an hour there, just enjoying the solitude and watching the water. When I decided to head back, the sun was directly overhead. I remember checking my watch. It was just past noon. I figured I'd take a different route back to the truck, maybe scout some new territory while I was at it. About 15 minutes into my return hike, I stopped to drink some water from my canteen and catch my breath. That's when it happened. The scream came from nowhere, high-pitched and unnatural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not a bobcat, not a fox, not a person. It cut through the forest silence like a knife, making the hair on my arms stand up. It was loud enough that I instinctively dropped into a crouch, my hand going to my rifle. Then, maybe 10 seconds later, the exact same scream again. Same pitch, same duration, same everything. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Animals don't scream twice in exactly the same way. I scanned the trees, trying to pinpoint where it had come from. That's when I noticed a slight movement about 25 yards away. The forest was dense there, lots of underbrush and fallen logs, but something had definitely moved. I focused my eyes, and that's when I saw it, a patch of dark brownish fur visible between 2 trees. It was just a glimpse, but I knew immediately it wasn't right. The color was off, not the reddish brown of a deer or the black of a bear. It was a muddy, dirty brown, almost like old coffee grounds. I'm an experienced hunter. I know every animal in those woods, or at least I thought I did. This didn't match anything I recognized. The fur seemed matted and thick, but I couldn't see what it was attached to. My first instinct should have been to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, waiting for whatever it was to show itself properly. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that heavy, waiting silence that feels like pressure against your eardrums. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, I glanced back to where I'd seen the fur. It was gone. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but no, whatever had been there had moved without making a sound. Not a twig snap, not a leaf rustle, nothing. I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it when that scream came again. This time, it was behind me. My blood turned to ice. I'd been watching the spot in front of me so intently that something had circled around behind me without me noticing. The scream came again, identical to the first 2, and I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. About 20 yards away, crouching behind a large bush, was something big. I couldn't see all of it, just the outline of what looked like a head peering around the side of the bush. And that head, it wasn't right. It was too large, too round, sitting oddly on whatever body it was attached to. I caught a glimpse of that same dark fur and what might have been an arm or a leg, longer and thinner than it should have been. It was moving around the bush, not in a natural way, but deliberately, like it was trying to get a better look at me without exposing itself. That's when the realization hit me like a physical blow. This thing was stalking me. It had circled around behind me while I was distracted, and now it was watching, assessing. In that moment, pure instinctual fear took over, not the kind of startled fear when something jumps out at you, but deep, primal terror that seems to come from somewhere in your DNA. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to run. I turned and started walking uphill toward where my truck was parked, moving as fast as I could without actually running. Something told me not to run, maybe because I didn't want to trigger a chase response, or maybe because I was afraid to take my eyes off my surroundings. My hands were shaking so badly I had to tighten my grip on my rifle to keep from dropping it. The forest that had seemed so familiar that morning now felt alien and hostile. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. I kept expecting to hear that scream again, but the woods had fallen into that unnatural silence that's somehow worse than any sound. I didn't look back, not once, until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, picked them up with trembling fingers, and finally got the door open. Only when I was inside with the doors locked did I allow myself to look back toward the forest. Nothing was there, at least nothing I could see. But I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched, like whatever it was had followed me all the way to the edge of the woods and was now standing just beyond the tree line, observing. I started the engine and got out of there so fast I nearly put the truck in the ditch. The whole way home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me on the road. When I got back to my parents' place, I was still living with them at the time, I didn't tell them what happened. What could I say? That I'd seen some unknown creature in the woods? That I'd been stalked by something I couldn't identify? They'd think I was crazy, or that I'd been drinking. A week later, my dad mentioned that his buddy Jim had been out to set up a deer stand in that same area and had heard something large run off through the underbrush. When Jim went to check for deer tracks afterward, he found nothing, no tracks at all, which was strange given how soft the ground was from recent rain. I've gone back and forth over the years about what I encountered that day. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a bear, maybe one with mange or some other condition that changed its appearance. But bears don't scream like that, and they don't stalk people the way this thing stalked me. Whatever was in those woods that day in '78 wasn't natural. The way it moved, the way it screamed, the way it deliberately circled behind me. It was intelligent, calculating, and those glimpses I caught, that strange fur, that oversized, oddly shaped head, they don't match any animal I've ever seen or heard of. I never went back to that specific area again. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods, but never alone and never near that creek. For years, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, that scream echoing in my head. Even now, all these decades later, when I'm out in the woods and the birds suddenly go quiet, I get that same feeling of being watched. I've researched local legends since then, trying to find anything that matches what I saw. There are stories of course, every rural area has them. Tales of wild men in the woods, unexplained creatures, things that don't quite fit into the natural order. But nothing that exactly matches what I experienced. The strangest part? About 5 years after my encounter, a hunter went missing in those same woods. They found his truck, his gear, even his rifle leaning against a tree. But they never found him. The official report said he probably got disoriented and died of exposure. But I've always wondered if he saw what I saw, and if he didn't get away in time. I'm 67 now, and I still don't know what was in those woods that day. But I know what I saw and what I heard, and I know that for a few terrifying minutes, I was being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear that same high-pitched, identical scream in the distance, calling out twice in succession, just like it did all those years ago. Story 16. I never thought I'd be one of those people. You know the type. Folks who claim they've seen something unexplainable and expect others to believe them. My wife Ellen and I have always considered ourselves practical people. I spent 43 years as an electrical engineer before retiring, and Ellen taught high school biology. We're not prone to flights of fancy or making up stories for attention, but what happened on August 29th, 2019 changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It's been over 4 years, and I still get goosebumps every time I think about it. Ellen and I were about 3 weeks into our retirement road trip through Western Canada in our 30-foot Winnebago. We'd saved for this trip for years, our big reward after decades of working. That morning, we'd left a campground near Belle Two, heading south on Highway 37 through British Columbia. It's an incredibly remote stretch of road that winds through some of the most pristine wilderness I've ever seen. Dense forests, mountains, and hardly any signs of civilization for hours at a time. The weather that day was perfect. Clear blue skies, about 65 degrees, not a cloud in sight. Around 2 in the afternoon, we were cruising down the highway, maybe going 50 miles per hour. Ellen was reading her novel in the passenger seat while I drove. We just crossed over the Nass River Bridge and were in this section where the forest comes right up to the road on both sides. I remember checking my side mirrors because we'd been seeing logging trucks all morning, and I didn't want one tailgating us on the narrow road. That's when Ellen suddenly grabbed my arm. "Robert, look, what is that?" I looked where she was pointing, ahead on the right side of the road. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear. We'd seen several black bears already on our trip, but this was no bear. About 50 yards ahead of us, something huge was emerging from the tree line. My first thought was honestly that someone was playing a prank, like one of those viral videos where people dress in gorilla costumes to scare hikers. But we were miles from anywhere, and what stepped onto the highway moved in a way no person in a costume could possibly move. It walked upright, completely bipedal, with a smooth, purposeful stride that was disturbingly human-like, but the proportions were all wrong. This thing was massive. I'd estimate well over 7 feet tall, maybe even closer to 8. And it was covered head to toe in thick, deep brown hair or fur, not patchy or uneven like you might expect from a bear with mange or some other wildlife explanation. This was uniform coverage, slightly longer on the shoulders and shorter on the limbs. The creature stepped onto the asphalt without hesitation, as if crossing highways was something it did regularly. What struck me most was how efficiently it moved. No wasted motion, no awkward lumbering, just smooth, confident strides. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down almost to its knees, and it had this thick, powerful build through the chest and shoulders that tapered to a narrower waist. Ellen squeezed my arm so hard I had bruises the next day. "Slow down," she whispered, like she was afraid it would hear her through the windshield and engine noise. I did ease off the gas, but I didn't dare stop completely. The highway was too narrow, with no proper shoulder in that section, and I kept thinking about those logging trucks barreling down the road. The last thing I wanted was to be sitting ducks if one came around the bend behind us. The creature, and I know how this sounds, but there's no other word for it except Sasquatch, crossed the entire 2-lane highway in maybe 6 or 7 strides. It never turned to look at us, never acknowledged our presence at all. It just moved with purpose, like it had somewhere specific to be on the other side of that road. As it reached the opposite tree line, I saw its profile more clearly. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders, no visible neck to speak of. And the face, I only caught a glimpse, but it wasn't like the exaggerated gorilla features you see in documentaries or movies. It was more subdued, more human-like, with a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a flatter nose. Then it was gone, disappearing into the trees on the left side of the highway. I remember the silence in our motorhome after it happened. For maybe 30 seconds, neither of us said a word. Then Ellen started frantically digging in her purse. "Where's my phone? Did you see that? Please tell me you saw that too." "I saw it," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to me. "I definitely saw it." By the time Ellen found her phone, we were well past the spot where it had crossed. I considered turning around, but something stopped me. Part rational. Fear. What if it was still there? What if it wasn't alone? And part something else I can't quite explain. A feeling that we had witnessed something we weren't supposed to see. Something private. We drove another 10 miles before I finally pulled over at a small gravel turnout. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Ellen and I just looked at each other, both of us pale. "That was," she started. "A Sasquatch," I finished. "We just saw a Sasquatch cross the highway in broad daylight." I've replayed that moment in my mind thousands of times since then. Sometimes I wonder if we should have stopped, if we should have tried to get evidence. But honestly, in that moment, it didn't even occur to me to grab my phone or our camera from the back. We were both too stunned, too caught in the moment to think about documentation. The thing is, I've seen the Patterson-Gimlin footage dozens of times over the years. I always thought it was interesting, but probably fake. Some guy in a suit filmed in the 60s. But what we saw moved nothing like a person in a costume could move. The fluidity, the natural way its muscles seem to work beneath that hair. No costume technology I know of can replicate that. We saw it for maybe 15 seconds total, but those seconds fundamentally changed how I understand the world. I know what I saw. Ellen knows what she saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't a person. It was something else entirely. That evening, we made it to a campground near Kitwanga. As soon as we parked, I got on my laptop and started researching Sasquatch sightings in British Columbia. Turns out, Highway 37 is a hotspot for this kind of thing. Locals sometimes call it the Bigfoot Highway. There are dozens of reported sightings in that exact area, many of them describing exactly what we saw. A large, upright, hair-covered creature crossing the road and disappearing into the forest. I found myself reading these accounts with new eyes. Before, I'd have been skeptical, looking for the logical explanations, the reasons people might be mistaken or lying. Now, I was nodding along thinking, yes, that's exactly what we saw. Ellen and I debated whether to report our sighting. In the end, we decided against it. What would be the point? We had no evidence, just our word. And after reading online about how witnesses get treated, the ridicule, the accusations of hoaxing, we decided to keep it mostly to ourselves. We've told a few close friends, people we trust, not to think we've gone senile in our retirement, but this is the first time I'm writing it all down. The weirdest part is how normal everything else was that day. The sun kept shining, logging trucks kept rumbling past. We continued our vacation, visiting the places we'd planned to visit, taking the photos we'd planned to take. But something had shifted inside both of us. That night at the campground, Ellen and I sat outside with glasses of wine, looking at the stars and the dark outline of trees against the night sky. We'd been married for 38 years at that point, and I thought I knew everything about her. But seeing her face as she processed what we'd witnessed, this new expression of wonder and uncertainty, made me realize there are always new things to learn about the people closest to us, just as there are always new things to learn about the world we think we understand. "Do you think it knew we were there?" she asked me. "I think it knew and didn't care," I replied. "Like we weren't worth worrying about." That thought has stuck with me. Whatever that creature was, it moved with the confidence of something that isn't hunted, something at the top of its food chain. It wasn't afraid of us or our vehicle. We were just passing through its territory, insignificant. 4 years later, I still get chills when I think about those 15 seconds on Highway 37. Not because I'm afraid of what we saw, but because it forced me to confront how little we actually know about the world around us. How many other things might exist in those vast stretches of wilderness that science hasn't catalogued or explained? I was an engineer for over 4 decades. I believe in what I can measure, test, and verify. But I also know what I saw with my own eyes, in broad daylight, with perfect visibility. I saw a Sasquatch cross that highway as casually as a person might cross a quiet street, and no amount of rational explanation has been able to convince me otherwise. Sometimes I wish we'd stopped, sometimes I'm glad we didn't. But mostly, I'm just grateful to have experienced something so extraordinary, to have glimpsed, however briefly, a mystery that remains unsolved. It reminds me that even at 71 years old, the world can still surprise you, still challenge everything you think you know. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't have believed it myself if someone had told me this story before that day. But it happened, it was real, and I'll carry that certainty with me for whatever time I have left.